Okay, Tela. I guess we should begin, right? We should be timely, and whoever comes in afterwards, right? So welcome to Stony Brook, Southampton. We are so excited to have the second Seed to Soil Symposium. And we are really grateful to Sean Barrett from Montauk Seaweed Company, who called up last year and said, Judy Ann, I think that Stony Brook should host a Seed to Soil Summit. And he said it would be great if Chris Gobler would get involved. That would just make it awesome. And I called Chris, and he said, absolutely. So we had our first Seed to Soil Symposium last year, and it was a great success. And so much of a success in my eyes that two young ladies who will be giving the keynote address emailed several months later to say that they were really greatly informed by the symposium and had written an amazing report. I'm adding the amazing report to it. So their report was Regenerative Agriculture and Restorative Aquaculture in Coastal Foodscapes. And I thought it really just hit the mark on what we were trying to communicate and educate people about, is that we really need to look at the environment, holistically, and see seed to soil as very much interrelated and interconnected, especially as it pertains to the health of our environment in our area that we live in. And the fact that we live in a coastal foodscape, I loved that terminology because so much of us are just terrestrial and stay on the ground and think of food as, from farms or from ranches or whatnot. But we are just so surrounded by water, and it's much more water than land, right? So I think it's very particular to be in this environment as well. My name is Judy Ann Carmack-Fayez, and I'm the executive director of FOODLAB, and it's my great pleasure to have some great speakers today. So we're going to start with Kelly McKlinchey and Violet Low-Bienart from Yale University. These are the two young ladies who came and wrote the report, so they will tell us all about their work. And we're waiting for Tela Troge, but Tela is who is from the Shinnecock Kelp Farmers, and will be speaking to us about her work here. And we talk about all of this work as being new, but it's really taken place for millennia, and we can really be greatly, greatly informed by indigenous practices. So I'm really happy that you're here to speak about that, particularly since all this land that we're on was Shinnecock land. So we have a lot to learn. Katie Wooton, our senior research scientist from Stony Brook University, will be discussing some of her research based on, I guess, boron and soil. You'll talk more about that. And then Sue Wicks could not make it today. She had an emergency. So Will Peckham from West Robbins Oyster Company will be, thank you, will be speaking in her place, and he agreed to do that this morning, so thank you so much. I saw your oyster farm a couple of years ago and was really greatly impressed, and it's right here in North Sea. And then we have our esteemed distinguished professor and endowed chair of coastal ecology and conservation, Professor Chris Gobler, who will follow with that and talk about all of his research. And then he will be followed by Bonnie Brady, who's the executive director of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association, and she will talk about the state of the sea. And closing remarks will be done by no other than Suffolk County Legislator Ann Welker, who is a strong environmentalist, and we're really happy that she's here to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you. Oh, and I have to say that this production is possible because of Frank Imperial. He is an amazing asset to Stony Brook and to our department, but the space, the fact that we're able to live stream and record this is all due to Frank. So thank you. And one other shout out is my team, my FOODLAB team out in the garden. They're working behind the scenes, but I wanted to say thank you to them, Maria Plitt, Jonathan Fletcher, and Julian Chang. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Kelly and Violet up to the stage.
Hi, everyone.
I'll stand here.
Yeah. We're really excited to be here to open up this amazing conference. We're going to be talking, as Julianne said, about our report, which is called Surf to Turf, Linking Regenerative Agriculture and Restorative Aquaculture in Coastal Foodscapes. We were here last year at this very conference, and we gained so much information and knowledge. And while we have been working on our report already, it really added to it. And so we're really excited to be back, to be sharing with everyone what we learned over the past 2-ish years. And so quickly, I'm Violet Low-Bienart. I'm a Master's of Environmental Management candidate at the School of the Environment.
And I'm Kelly McKlinchey. I am a graduate of the Yale School of the Environment in the same program, currently doing consulting in sustainability and the food system. And it's important to note that I am a native Long Islander, born and raised here, so it's super. I worked for Cornell Cooperative Extension in Suffolk County for a number of years, so it's like always lovely to come back, and thank you again for inviting us.
And so Kelly will go more into this, but this is our report. Here's a QR code, but also we'll bring this slide back up at the very end. The very function of our report is we were really interested in looking about how regenerative agriculture have been talked about quite frequently in restorative aquaculture, but oftentimes in silos. We wanted to really talk to experts, to do our own research, to understand what were the ways and the practices that had already occurred that were being innovated on to connect these two systems. And so today we'll follow a similar structure of report. Kelly will give us the historical sea-to-soil connections, although a brief snapshot of this giant field. I'll talk a bit about some of the best practices that we've heard through talking to people and doing our own research. We'll talk about case studies, who are some cool organizations or people doing really amazing work in this field right now, some barriers to the connections, opportunities, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. So I like to show these two videos. If they're gonna, oh, perfect, Frank, thank you so much. No sound. I get worried every time that sound's gonna come on and you're gonna hear like loud mooing and a motor, but it didn't, so thank you, Frank. So like when we think about sea to soil, we think about surf to turf, how are these two systems connected? Often, as Violet said, some of us might be working in marine biology, we might be working in agriculture, and we're not thinking about them holistically, even though these systems are incredibly, what's happening? Hold on. Am I hitting the wrong?
That's back.
This one is, right? Sorry, everyone.
Back is here.
I think I've lost control. And okay, great, okay. and we'll just go here, it's fine. Okay, so these systems are actually connected by vast cycles of water, nutrients, and less spoken about, but hopefully we'll hear from a little bit from us and from other speakers today, by people, right? People and communities that connect these two systems. And so we really, as Violet shared, set out, I mean, almost 3 years ago now, to look at what are the ways that practitioners, visionaries, farmers, politicians, et cetera, are thinking about the connections between land and sea. And where aren't they, but maybe they could be. So these like sort of big questions form the motivation for the project. And we're going to kind of walk through this, but to give you a little bit of a teaser of where we're going to go, there's a lot of opportunity by thinking about seed to soil. It's amazing that there's even a seed to soil symposium once, as we said to Judy Ann, but that there's a second year happening is super exciting. We have a lot of opportunity in this space and with the people gathered in this room. To be thinking more holistically about how we manage ecosystems across the land-sea boundary, right? Particularly important, as Judy Ann was saying, where we are right now on Long Island. I live in Mystic, Connecticut now. I've crossed the Sound, but also living in a coastal community, a coastal landscape where these issues are really important. So what is the potential or the promise of an integrated approach? Well, one, as you'll hear from other speakers today, so we'll just touch on it, right? But oyster and seaweed aquaculture both have the opportunity to take up excess nutrient that's moving through the watershed into places like the Sound, and could be coming from land-based agriculture upstream. Because of that, restorative aquaculture has the opportunity to really be bridging, creating a bridge between nutrient cycles on land and sea. Really importantly, and we'll maybe a little bit less discussed just given time constraints today, but that came up a lot in our research, is the opportunity to provide new kinds of revenue streams for people working on the water, but also farmers working on the land, right? An opportunity to diversify and broaden revenue streams for practitioners. Restore degraded coastal habitat because of that filtering capability of both seaweed and oysters. And then what we're really excited about is the opportunity to enhance overall food systems resilience. And there's the ecological piece, but there's the community piece, right? Bringing people together in a space like this who are working on the water, but are also working on the land, and thinking about common challenges and common opportunities shared across both. So I won't make you read this, or we won't make you read this, but this is really kind of putting it up here to share for later. This is really the synthesis. If you don't read the report, which I'm not necessarily expecting you to, this kind of sums up what we're getting at here, right? That ocean health and soil health are not separate objectives. They're interconnected, and we really do ourselves a disservice by not thinking about them holistically. And in that same vein, we have an opportunity to be thinking about those connections in the way that we manage our food systems. Okay, so before I turn it over to Violet to discuss some of the best practices that emerged with the interviews that we did, and just to reiterate, the formation of this report was a coupling of a literature review, research, but also stakeholder interviews with a lot of focus on the Northeast, but elsewhere as well. So before we dive into some of the best practices that emerged from those interviews, it's, as Violet shared, important to note that these practices are not new. And what I'm going to share here is just like a sample of some of the historical examples that emerged in our research. And I think Tela is going to share a lot more about what has been happening here for time immemorial. So we'll just be giving a quick kind of brief highlights that we found in our research, just to set the stage there. I also just want to, I put a note to myself, we would welcome any examples that folks have come across in your work. I think I'll diverge to say one of the cool things that has come out of this report was published in February. And we've already gotten a couple of emails being like, we're doing this, we're feeding, we're growing kelp and we're feeding it to our farm up the road, to their sheep. Super interesting, specific things that have emerged. And so we're really hoping that this will continue to spark a dialogue across our communities. Okay, so again, these practices are not new. Violet's gonna be talking about seaweed as a soil amendment. The first recorded use of seaweed as a fertilizer goes back to the 1st century AD, and what's important to call out there is the first recorded use, right? So we know the Romans were doing this in some way, but goes back much further than that. In actual practice. It's been used as fodder for livestock for many, many centuries. I had the chance through this report before Violet actually started, or through this project before Violet started at Yale, to go over to Ireland and spent a couple of weeks meeting with farmers, with foragers, with gardeners, and it's really part of the lifeblood there to be just gathering, still today, to be gathering seaweed and applying it on smallhold plots, but also larger scale farms. This is actually a picture I took of a kelp house from the mid-1800s, and you used to see these kelp houses along the shoreline all over the place. They're storage facilities for seaweed because kelp in particular, but other seaweeds were such a core part of the production happening over there, and particularly foraging or gathering. So in Ireland, this is another Ireland picture of just seaweed directly, or some bits of seaweed put directly on a raised bed of lettuce. It's actually really good for the sandy soils of coastal environments like Ireland, and so we can take that over to here as well in terms of actually improving the soil structure, right? Adding that organic matter in and helping improve the tilth, improve the water holding capacity. Again, lots of tradition and folklore even about seaweed. I love to share, there's a song, has anyone heard the song Dúlaman? It's an Irish working song. That's your homework, to go listen to the song Dúlaman. I named my dog Dúlaman, actually. We call her Dooley, yes. It's the Irish word for seaweed, and in particular channel rack. And part of what it's a working song that people would sing while they're working the fields. And it tells the story, you hear different versions, but in part about 2 different kinds of seaweed, and that one of the seaweeds fed to the sheep would improve their coats, right? So there's a lot of lore when you actually start digging into this. And in the song almost paints seaweeds as these figures to be respected, and they're characters in a story. So in particular, what's that? I will not be singing for you, Judy Ann. Thank you for the prompt, but you can listen to it. There's a great recording by Celtic Woman. Thank you, though. Next time, maybe. No. And then here in New England, these, again, are just pictures that I was able to grab right through. This is Historic New England, the source. This dates back to the late 1800s. I have, again, would love another piece of homework, have come across a few times that there used to be a designated holiday in New England, a designated day for gathering seaweed for farmers. A strange holiday, if you ask me, but dating back to the 19th century. Would love to hear if anyone's in our Q&A, if anyone's come across that as well. But this was a big part of farming life in New England. Again, picture from early 1900s in Cape Cod, gathering seaweed and bringing it back to agricultural production areas. The next 2, just going to kind of briefly mention that it's not just seaweed, right? In the Northeast, salt hay, which is our salt meadow cordgrass, one of the dominant marsh grasses, was harvested and used as mulch, as fodder, again, for livestock. It was a major cash crop until the early 1900s in this area. I'll come back to a note on how that's not an entirely positive story in a second. And then oysters as well, right? So we think about, obviously, oysters as having a long and deep, we're going to hear more about that from people who know way more about it than Violet and I later today. But I think we are very familiar with oysters as for human consumption, but they also traditionally, going back again for centuries, and in this area in particular, were used as a quote-unquote sweetener for agricultural fields, a way to increase the nutrients and also help deal with acidic soils in particular. This is a great quote that I love from Mark Kurlansky's book, The Big Oyster, just about basically this observation in the 1700s of seeing oyster shells thrown whole, not even crushed, on fields. What I want to point out about both salt hay and oysters, and is maybe a bit of a cautionary tale for seaweed, is in both of these cases, in this area in particular, these resources were way over harvested, way over extracted, right? So it's important, and hopefully we can have a dialogue today about how we need to be thinking about this with seaweed, right? That we acknowledge that there's got to be a balance in how we're using these marine resources. But these three are like great examples of right here in the Northeast, of how we were moving marine nutrients to land-based agriculture and have been for a long time. So what does this look like today? Well, unfortunately, when you think about modern sea-to-soil connections or soil-to-sea connections in the 21st century related to food systems, it's not a very happy story typically, right? This is a picture of the Gulf Stream, of nutrient runoff, largely from agricultural sources, creating harmful algal blooms that could create no oxygen or low oxygen zones and create die-offs for marine species. Also, a lot of the aquaculture or finfish aquaculture that we see today is dependent on monocultures of corn. I love this photo from Johns Hopkins or image. That when we're eating fish or farmed fish, a lot of it can be very much dependent on monocultures of corn from the Midwest. So and that's pretty much all I'm going to say about this, just to say that there's a lot of complexity here, and often the narrative is quite negative in the day-to-day when we think about land and sea connections in agriculture in the 21st century. And that's really what we sought to understand. Is there a positive story? What are people doing today to reclaim or maybe continue doing some of these past practices? And what's the opportunity to change this narrative from one of degradation, from one of destruction, to one of restoration when it comes to the sea-to-soil connection? And with that, I shall turn it back to Violet to talk about some of those examples.
Thank you, Kelly. So as Kelly just said, we really tried to conduct interviews, to do our own research to understand how this narrative could be changed, what are the practices already happening today. And just to reiterate, a lot of these practices that I'm going to talk about next are often considered innovative, new, kind of sexy in the media, when in fact they really build on millennia of practices, especially of indigenous knowledge and practices that often go unacknowledged. So just to state that up front. And so I'll just briefly touch on 4 practices that we highlighted in our report. There are so many amazing things that you can do to connect sea to soil. These are some of the 4 that we just heard about the most, as they are most relevant, or we just heard them the most in this context. And so the first one, as already mentioned, is seaweed as an animal feed supplement. Reference's use of seaweed can really be traced back to even ancient Greek myths or Icelandic sagas. Depending on the nutritional species, seaweed can be a really valuable source of protein, complex carbs, minerals, and animal diets, which can lead to better animal productivity as well as animal health. Also really talked about lately is the ability of seaweed to reduce methane emissions from livestock. Initial studies have been really positive, but much more research needs to be done. And something interesting that came up in our interviews was that while methane is talked about a lot of people talked about that you actually need to have a broader value proposition for seaweed as an animal feed supplement, really talking about how it improves productivity and improves the end product in order for this market to get going. And that methane right now can really just be a helpful addition. And so some issues, if people talk about toxicity, especially with certain species or in certain amounts, as well as just when seaweed can kind of greenwash the overarching negative impacts of intensive animal agriculture that really has a lot of other problems that even adding seaweed and reducing methane won't fix. Seaweed as a soil amendment, we briefly touched on already, and we have a lot of experts here who can talk way more about this, but really has experienced a resurgence lately. Studies have really demonstrated the potential of seaweed inputs to enhance plant growth, condition soil, protect plants from stress, among a lot of other benefits. It also can create opportunities for restorative ocean farmers to sell their crop in new markets and new channels for them. It also can help reduce, albeit maybe slowly, the reliance on synthetic fertilizers. There's a lot of issues right now to the burgeoning market, such as cost, knowledge, infrastructure, and then local production in the face of global markets. Thirdly, conservation, agriculture for ocean health. There is a suite of practices that are land-based that can really help the downstream negative impacts of land-based agriculture into our waterways that both farmers and also landowners can employ. These practices can help mitigate potential negative impacts such as nutrient runoff, sedimentation, chemical contamination, among a lot of other issues. They're practices that you've all probably heard about, such as cover cropping, rotational grazing, buffer strips, and then precision nutrient management strategies. And then lastly, on water quality improvement, we also touched upon this already, but seaweed and marine bivalves have really emerged as highly efficient agents for absorbing and filtering excess nutrients. Bivalves can absorb nitrogen into their tissues and shells as they grow, and similarly, seaweed such as kelp can absorb actually pretty substantial quantities of nutrients as they grow and reproduce. And so a lot of farmers are really experimenting quite successfully in this area, as probably most of you know, with marine bivalves and kelp or other seaweeds as nutrient sucker-uppers. And with that, I'll hand it off to Kelly will talk a bit more about some case studies that we deep into.
So there's a lot more in the report. I want to give a nod to Montauk Seaweed Company in the back, who we got to meet last year. We also when we saw this symposium announced last year, we have to go because we've been targeting so many of these people, trying to get a hold of them to interview them. And so being able to just come and listen to some of what was shared by the Shinnecock Kelp Farmers, by Montauk Seaweed Co. last year was really special and so cool to see us all together again. So just going to share, I think, 3 samples or examples of some of the work that's highlighted in the report. One close to home, we're coming out of Yale University, actually very cool and longstanding partnership that the Yale farm, our campus farm, has with Greenwave. Greenwave has I'm not sure if sold or given some of their kelp to the Yale farm to experiment with, basically, as a soil amendment. This is a great picture of just that kelp drying in the small hoop house on the Yale farm. And it's used in a variety of ways at the Yale farm. And again, mostly educational, experimental, but interesting to see what they're up to on a small scale. The first image here is just directly adding it to a compost bin, so you can go about it that way. The top right, they were actually trying to kind of break it down a little bit more and ferment it in a bucket before applying it to the field. Bottom left, the Yale farm managers created almost like their own very rough dried soil amendment to add to the field. And then the last, and what you see a lot still in coastal communities, is just direct application to the field of that seaweed. What's special, I think, about what the Yale farm is doing in partnership with Greenwave is really trying to highlight this idea of a closed nutrient loop. The Yale farm is located right near the Mill River, which runs into the Long Island Sound. And by taking, you can actually, I wish we had a good visual, and I feel like Montauk Seaweed Company actually does on their website, so we'll direct you there. But you can visualize seaweed growing in the Long Island Sound, taking up nutrients, being added as a soil amendment in any of these forms to the Yale farm, reducing, not that the Yale farm is using this, but theoretically, right, reducing reliance on chemical fertilizers, helping actually create healthier waterways, right, that are then creating a better improved water quality downstream for that seaweed to keep growing, and so that virtuous cycle can continue. So the Yale farm, as an educational institution, really sees this as a learning opportunity about nutrient cycles. Ocean Hour Farm is up kind of near me in Rhode Island, also relatively new. I think it's sort of interesting, all these organizations that have started in the past few years. Founded in 2021, I want to say, took a really beautiful piece of property, basically in Newport, and kept it in farmland. And their whole mission is really around training other farmers and using their space as a test bed for practices that can all focused around water stewardship. So farming for ocean health, right? Soil health for ocean health. Water practices that can be cognizant of all the time, front and center, that water quality and that water health within farming practices. Sound waters, this is a great example of one of the conversations that emerged after the report was published, so you won't find it in there. But Sound Waters, if you're not familiar, wonderful organization focused on ocean education, marine education in Stamford, Connecticut. They are growing kelp. They're not selling it at all for consumption because it is mainly educational. Where this kelp is going almost entirely is to local farmers. Some are using it in their compost and applying it to fields, and others, and here's my favorite photo, are feeding it to livestock. I mean, you can't get a better, I wish we'd had access to that photo before we published the report, but I will share it now in lieu of that. Obviously this is like an extreme example, right? But you can do this, there is an opportunity there, and so some of Soundwater's kelp is going to livestock within the Connecticut, within the coastal food shed. And turning back to Violet to briefly talk about some barriers.
Yeah. So a lot of these barriers I think will be touched on in the next few speakers, and so I'll be very, very brief here. But see, these are some of the main barriers that came up in our conversation and our research, specifically in this region around connecting in sea to soil and some of the practices that are emerging. So the first one that came up quite a lot was just insufficient knowledge and training. While seaweed farming has a long history in many parts of the world, seaweed farming for production is relatively new in this region, and so there's just a whole host of technical training that needs to really be implemented, and structures are being put in place slowly. But really there needs to be more support for new farmers entering the market, or other shellfish farmers or other people who work with the ocean looking to add seaweed to their production mix. Shellfish farming for production has a much longer history in this region. However, knowledge gaps really still do exist when you talk to people, more on the side of like permitting, market development, and input costs. The next one is inadequate infrastructure, and we heard this time and time again that while there is some infrastructure in the region, there's just like really not enough to get markets up and going where they could be. Specifically, like we heard a lot about drying seaweed, and you saw that very small scale example at the Yale farm. But in order to really dry seaweed on a larger scale, you need infrastructure in place. And right now, a lot of people who are growing seaweed in this area are really just serving it wet, and so it has a pretty short shelf life. It needs to go to consumers or restaurants quite quickly. But when you're able to dry it, you're really able to expand the market and put it in a ton more products. And so really just the lack of infrastructure to dry, but also a lot of other types of processing infrastructure for these markets. Highly connected is just an underdeveloped market. There was really considerable excitement around kelp. Around 2016 or so. People were really talking about it as like this nutrient-rich superfood. It got like really sexy. You heard about it a lot in the media. But really the market hasn't developed in the ways that everyone thought it would. The number of kelp farms permitted in southern New England has increased. However, really the market has remained relatively unchanged, and the New England farmers that we talk to really aren't able to be price competitive when compared to the global market. And so really we found some really creative ways that people and farmers are skirting this and doing really creative things, but really in fact the market is quite underdeveloped and there's a lot more that we could do. And then lastly, I'll just touch on NIMBYism, and this came up a lot, not in my backyard. As coastal property gets bought up more and more, there's a lot of conflict between people who work in the water and people who look at the water. We heard a lot that someone's vision, if they live on the water, of what is an appropriate view or what the ocean should look like may not include a kelp farm or an oyster farm. And so some permitting issues can be heavily slowed down or either stopped. And so there was a lot of talk with people we talked with about the pressing need to help coastal homeowners deepen their understanding of and also emotional connection to the beauty and historical depths of working landscapes and not just landscapes within the places that they call home. So I'll pass it to Kelly for opportunities.
I don't know where to stand, and this is very
I
interesting.
know.
Okay, thank you, Violet. So bringing us home, and look, Judy-Ann, we took almost the full 30 minutes in the end, so. And really the focus of this report, which is very much if you haven't heard, like very qualitative. This was about story sharing. This was about gathering narratives from individuals that are doing this work and thinking on this topic. So through those interviews and our research, 4 key opportunities emerged, and they're pretty high level. One, as just a perfect segue to what Violet was saying, there's an opportunity here to be protecting working waterfronts and preserving coastal heritage, right? And this comes to, I'm sure we're going to hear about this from other speakers today, comes into play with seaweed farming in general. There's a lot of opportunity around this to create new kinds of income streams, and I think personally we think soil amendments and what folks like Montauk Seaweed Company are doing are just adding to that even more by creating additional market opportunity. Which brings me right down to developing market opportunities. It was really interesting talking to seaweed farmers about some of the challenges that they were facing with actually getting their product to market and the excitement they had around new pathways like soil fertilizer. In particular, what's interesting about the soil amendment market opportunity is that the seaweed can be in degraded condition. So I have one seaweed farmer near me in Stonington. We talk about the spoils to soil opportunity. Seaweed is a cold water, cold season crop. So once the water warms too much, it can be very susceptible to something called biofouling, where basically it's very likely that little marine organisms are going to be finding a nice home on that seaweed that makes it less palatable, less easy to sell for consumption. But it's great still for soil amendments, right? For someone like I'm seeing Trevor nod in the back for Montauk Seaweed Company. Bring your seaweed to Montauk Seaweed Company. So really exciting opportunities there in terms of expanding market reach. Something I'm personally really excited about is this idea of like forging new partnerships. There's a farm out by me in Mystic, Connecticut called Stone Acres, and there's a small nonprofit that operates out of there that has a pretty like long-standing partnership now with Stonington Kelp Company. And during the pandemic, because the hoop houses and greenhouses weren't really being used yet, we haven't talked about this yet, but seaweed, the seasonality of seaweed is quite complementary to like the typical growing season of a farmer in the Northeast, right? It's coming up for harvest. It came up for harvest in April, right? We're just coming off of like peak kelp season. So there's not a lot going on in farm hoop houses or greenhouses, right? So they were able to open up some of their farm infrastructure for processing kelp and address some of those processing issues. And lastly, again, we kind of already talked about this, so I'll just kind of flash this up here. But again, closing that nutrient cycle, closing the loop, creating really important bridges ecologically between land and sea that can help improve the environmental health of both ecosystems is a key opportunity. So some key takeaways before we turn it over to questions and hopefully some discussion. As we said in the beginning, soil health and ocean health are interconnected issues. We're sort of facing we are right now facing some of the most pressing challenges ever related to environmental health and climate change. And the more we can start thinking holistically and in an integrated manner around ocean and land ecosystems, the better off we're going to be down the line. Again, restorative aquaculture, and in particular seaweed farming, I think offers an important opportunity to create these bridges between land and sea. And again, driving this home, partnership is paramount. It's so important that we're thinking in new ways about the kinds of partnerships we can build across organizations and across individuals. And it's been really exciting to see that in our work over the past few years. So with that, we'll make you read through this, but this work was made possible by a lot of people, either interviews, listening to some of the folks that are in this room at last year's symposium, people giving their time and energy to talk to us about this subject. And finally, and most importantly, we invite you to dive and or dig, your choice or both, into our report. And if you just want to stay in touch and you have thoughts or you have questions, and tell me if this QR code works, because I am not tech savvy and I don't know if it will work. But our emails are up there if it doesn't work. And we would love to have a dialogue about this going forward. And thank you again to Judy Ann and to Dr. Gobler and the organizers of today's event for inviting us. Oh, it works? Well, that's great news.
And I just want to say this is a dialogue and conversation, so please feel free to ask a lot
Well, if you look at historical photos of Shinnecock Hills, you'll find kelp being farmed about 1 mile west where the Shinnecock Bay comes close to Montauk Highway. And my husband and I own 2 carriage gatehouses from 1891. Seaweed was the insulation.
Very cool.
So maybe that's a new purpose that could be brought back. Of course, when we took the ceiling down and the walls to restore them, the seaweed had dried to the bottom, so I'm not sure how long it lasts, but it had been put in circa 1891, and we did that like 2007.
Wow. Yeah, we focused today mostly on agriculture, right? But there are so many different uses. Seaweed has been used in all manner of things: dyes, building material, insulating material. So that's pretty cool. You found it in your house, Dr. Gobler.
Yeah, on the markets front, this might not be something to look at, but do you have any thoughts about like these 2 different types of markets? Is there like a low-hanging fruit market that you maybe stumbled upon? That is to say, like, would be super easy to spin up and maybe not the biggest revenue, but it's an obvious one that's missing. And then beyond that, because I think markets is what there's the enthusiasm for the hills, but it's markets that's going to drive it all.
Right.
So a low-hanging fruit market, and then maybe a tipping point market. So what would be the market that really, if that's established, then this is just going to go? We're going to hear lots about those 2 categories.
Yeah. Do you have any?
You can go out.
Okay. I hate to, like driving this home a lot, but there's a lot of excitement, at least by me in Southern New England, about the soil amendments opportunity. I actually know this is like a little bit of intel, but there's a group of farmers that are trying to get some grant funding to do research, and maybe Montauk Seaweed Company is connected to this, or you should be if you're not yet, to like demonstrate a case for how effective it is, because I think there's still more research needed on the efficacy. I think it's qualitatively known, but they're looking to actually try to apply for grant funding to investigate a little further the yield potential of soil amendments. But there's a lot of excitement about that spoils to soils opportunity within the local Southern New England market. I think larger scale, to your second question, the tipping point, I don't know. If I'm being transparent in this safe space, I get a little worried for seaweed that we don't want to scale too much, right? Like I think we've proven time and time again when the goal is like just scale, there can be a lot of issues with that. So what I get excited about with where seaweed is right now, and particularly where it's like very cool to be from here, to live across the sound, like where we are right now, I think, and largely because of the leadership of the people in this room and organizations like Green Wave, we have an opportunity to create a really strong market. I'm not sure if that's answering your question. I guess I don't necessarily see there being like the goal being, national production of seaweed, but that might be my own personal opinion.
I can also add, I think I do a lot of work on agroforestry as well, and I think that there's a lot of commonalities. This is not like a specific market, but just like the challenges that seaweed is facing right now. It's just like the challenges that a lot of agroforestry crops are facing as just like new markets that are really sustainable and can be environmentally friendly, and that I agree with Kelly. We didn't come across like, wow, this like bingo, this perfect market, but I really think for anything market expansion that like infrastructure just came up again and again. This comes up in agroforestry as well. It's just like for any market, there needs to be like in a perfect world, like communal infrastructure hubs where like farmers can do so much more than just dry. Like they can connect farmers, they can just do so much more. And so I think even like before there is like the perfect market, it's just like building up that infrastructure.
Yeah.
Question regarding kelp and seaweed as food and what kind of markets. I know I've seen it being fed to animals and livestock, but where is the space for kelp or seaweed as a food good?
Plenty, and honestly, it's you didn't hear it from us simply because it wasn't a focus of our report, because we feel like others have done that really well, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about that today. But that's part of where I think there is excitement about the soil amendment, the farm partnership opportunity, because as Violet mentioned, one of the things we heard again and again is that there's been some, I think, a little more resistance or difficulty, you could say, in bringing seaweed to the average consumer's palate, right? I know out by me we've got some fantastic, Mystic is a great food and beverage scene. I invite you all to come. We've got 2 James Beard nominated chefs this year. So there's some farmers, or chefs rather, who are really focused on those direct farm relationships, they're like, give me whatever you're experimenting with and I will play with that, right? And we'll put it on the menu and we'll make candied kelp, literally, as like an amuse-bouche for the restaurant. But it's still relatively niche. I think folks like Atlantic Sea Farms, who we had a chance to connect with through this project, are working on ways to create products, create market opportunities that are scalable by partnering with giant companies or retail chains like Whole Foods. And so there's opportunity there. And I think we're seeing some traction that to be quite honest, for the past 5 years has been a little bit stagnant from our observation, from what we heard. Trevor.
It's great to see you, and thank you for everything. It's really wonderful to see your hard work. I just have a question. You mentioned a few times just sort of caution around scaling. I'm wondering if you could get into that a little bit more. Are you referring to any specific issues that you've seen regarding large-scale seaweed farming, or are you speaking more towards growing a new industry with some certain amount of measure and not replicating issues that we have currently from just like full-scale unbridled capitalistic growth? So if you could just sort of fill that out a little more.
That's a great question. I don't mean to insinuate that scale is bad. Obviously, as a small business owner and someone who's worked with a lot of small businesses, like growth is what we're shooting for. Do you want me to shoot and then okay. I didn't mean to jump in. I think I kind of mean both a little bit. With the first ecologically, and this is where a lot of the work that Green Wave has made popular, I'll put it that way, right, is around polycultures. How do we think, if we're trying to create or recreate in some cases, but seaweed aquaculture is new, you could say that, within the Northeast, at least the way that we're doing it now. Can we do that in a way that's not replicating all of the pitfalls of land-based agriculture, right? Can we think about right scale for the marine ecosystem in which we're growing? And can we think about maybe not just seaweed, not just kelp, but other kinds of marine life, right? Like don't have it here, but I'm sure many of you have seen. They've got great visuals around incorporating mussels and other shellfish, right? I remember Tela spoke last year about other kinds of seaweed, right? Like, I mean, like even just our narrow focus on kelp, I think, is a little bit of a caution of let's think more broadly about what we mean by seaweed and what potential is there. The second piece, which has now escaped me of what you just said, Trevor.
The economic side of scale in terms of growing a new domestic industry.
Yes. No, I think it's less. So, yeah. I mean, I think again, kind of a similar story there, socioeconomically, of how do we not replicate some of the challenges that we've faced in other parts of the food chain with other commodities, right? Just to say that we have, because it is like growing from the ground up, from the seabed up, right? There's this opportunity to bring in other voices, to make sure that farmers are getting paid the way that they should, right? And I think some of those where we run into hurdles there come with scale. So not to say that scale is inherently bad by any means, but that there's something we just need to be thinking about there as people that are helping build this space. Does that help?
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is that at present, and going more specifically to the ecological side of things, you're not seeing any necessarily bad examples or bad outcomes from, say, seaweed farming.
Yeah, within the context of the Northeast, I'll like caveat there, right? I think what's happening in the Northeast is what you just said, so.
Sorry, yeah, it's just a question I had because, like, I always sort of felt like, you know, there's no downside to kelp farming. And I'm just curious if you have examples of, like, well, there's things that are going on.
I'm getting a time check from Judy Ann, so we'll continue the conversation afterwards, but thank you so much for the questions. And thank you, Judy Ann.
And there'll be a Q&A after, and then plenty of time to speak, as it's a great subject, and we just have a lot of great speakers today, so I want to carry on. So next up is Tela Troge, who is from the Shinnecock Kelp Farmers, and I think you can give us a lot of those answers, and you probably had a lot to add about the history of kelp farming as well as what it's like working on the water as well. And I'd love for you to address that because I thought it was very interesting to talk about working coastal landscapes because people are so, I guess, the Westerners are so protective of their property and don't see the environment in the same way or in a way that they should. It's not a holistic view. So maybe if you could touch base on that a little bit too, that would be cool. So please come on up. Tela Troge.
Hakame, welcome to Shinnecock Hills. This is the ancestral territory of the Shinnecock Nation. This college is located in the heart of Shinnecock Hills, which is some of our most sacred land, particularly burial land. It is land, unfortunately, that was stolen from us by the state of New York in violation of federal law in 1859. It is connected to both the Shinnecock Bay and the Peconic Bay, which are very important water sources for us. We consider them sacred. For almost 13,000 years, they were our primary source of food. We are very much marine ecosystem based. We had a diet of shellfish and fish and all of the just beautiful, abundant food sources. And so just a little bit about me. I grew up on the Shinnecock territory. We live multi-generationally just because we were reduced to such a small land base. So I lived with my grandmother in what's now known as Ma's house, which is a BIPOC art studio run by my cousin Jeremy Dennis. And I do encourage everyone to visit. There's an incredible amount of artists who visit from all around the world. And when they learn about the Shinnecock Kelp Farmers, I'm always amazed at the art that comes out of the studio that really helps spread the message and awareness about how vital seaweed is to our local story here, and it amplifies the importance of us engaging in this type of work together. So I grew up in that house with my grandmother and my cousins. I have a twin brother, my mother, my father, aunt, uncles. And we had a path that went down to Hetty Creek, which is a part of Shinnecock Bay. And so I very much grew up on the water. And I remember my childhood, there was so much marine life. I had always dreamed of becoming a marine biologist. My mother ran the Shinnecock Oyster Hatchery, which was the first solar-powered oyster hatchery, or really any type of shellfish hatchery on the East Coast. And it was a very successful industry for the Shinnecock Nation up until the red tides and the brown tides that really devastated this region and caused a lot of harm that we're still now recovering from. But it raised a lot of awareness about the lack of septic systems in the area. So as we know, a huge part of the problem here with the nutrient runoff is due to agriculture, but it's also because of our lack of wastewater treatment and septic systems. And growing up in a community that relies primarily, again, on the water for food, we saw almost a complete collapse in our traditional food sources, which for us led to a really dire situation. because again, New York State had stolen most of our land base, and there's just a lot of racism in the area that contributes to a lot of economic harm, making it hard for most members of Shinnecock Nation to seek gainful outside employment. And so I just want to caution, when we're talking about seaweed and kelp and sea lettuce and all of the wonderful gifts from the sea that we saw described as a cash crop in the 1900s, that we really be cognizant of the fact that this is a natural resource that many people have relied on for, again, millennia, for the well-being of the entire community. And so I grew up, I wanted to be a marine biologist, but I ended up becoming an attorney instead, so a little bit of a shift. We became the Shinnecock Kelp Farmers in 2019. We were approached by Sean, who at that time was working as a board member for Green Wave, and we were intergenerational, women's-based collective. And one of our founders, Becky Genia, was featured in a film called Conscious Point, which is about the land development in this area, the overdevelopment, which has caused a really massive disruption to the water quality in the area. And again, with the lack of septic systems and the overdevelopment, it's really a recipe for disaster. And so when you look at the problems that climate change has brought to the area and all the nutrient runoffs, you can link it not only to the overdevelopment of the Shinnecock Hills that we saw in the 1970s, which is when the United States government decided that they were not going to take up Shinnecock Nation's claim for the violation of the Non-Intercourse Act that took all of this land from us. We saw this boom in development. And so a lot of people think that climate change can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution. But when you actually look at the charts of when we start to see huge increases in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, it goes back to colonization. And so I think that when we talk about these things in regenerative agriculture and restorative aquaculture, that we really need to shift our gears back to what was happening prior to colonization. And for the Shinnecock Nation, there was never any type of separation from sea or land. It was very much connected. We had a very high population, which we were able to support not only from the bounty of the sea, but by an advanced agricultural system, which relied on seaweed in order to complete the nutrient, specifically nitrogen loop for corn, bean, and squash. And through this method of agriculture, we would add seaweed together with fish to fertilize our crops, and we're able to sustain, up until colonization, really robust population. And so that was, of course, disrupted in 1640 when the first settlers came. And by 1659, we start to see a lot of reserved rights come up to seaweed. And so a lot of people think, oh, Shinnecock Nation, they don't have any treaties, but when you start to look at a lot of the land deeds, we had started to make agreements specifically regarding food. So we started to reserve our rights to hunt and to fish and to gather. And so those were pretty well respected up until about the mid-1800s. And so in the mid-1800s, we saw really an increase in the amount of settlers who came, and with that, an increase in livestock. And so I was really happy to see in Kelly and Violet's presentation the photos of the cart with the horse and the seaweed cart, because as an attorney, when Sean first approached me from Green Wave, and he said, I saw this movie that Becky was starred in, and it changed my life, and would you happen to have any interest in seaweed? I said, yes, very much so, because as an attorney, I knew that the Shinnecock Nation was able to achieve finally recognition from the United States government based on a series of cases that are called the seaweed cases. And so the seaweed cases are legal cases from the Suffolk County court system that were from the it was 1848 they started, and there were these disputes over seaweed carts. And so basically Shinnecock Nation members had collected all of these carts of seaweed, which were then stolen by the townspeople, and they carted off to their farms in order to feed their livestock. By then it was a cash crop, and how easy just to go down to the beach and just take all of the seaweed that Shinnecock had already gathered. And so the court ultimately found through a series of cases that started in 1848 that the Shinnecock Nation had retained all of the rights to seaweed that is grown in the Shinnecock Bay and the Peconic Bay completely. And that was well respected until, again, 1859, when the Shinnecock Hills were stolen from us. Fast forward 200 years, we have a very interesting situation where, you know, we talk about partnerships and the importance of being inclusive, and how we have this fundamental understanding that, yes, we should braid together or weave together traditional, ecological, indigenous knowledge with modern science in order to create an industry that is beneficial to everyone. And, you know, it's said in conferences and written up in reports, but then when you're actually in the field, it's not happening. Most recently, we had Governor Hochul, one of her first acts as the new governor of New York, she legalized the commercial cultivation of seaweeds, only sugar kelp. There was no, it wasn't all seaweed, just sugar kelp in the specific geographic regions of Gardiner's Bay and Peconic Bay. And so just a couple months ago, maybe just a month ago, Suffolk County announced as part of that they were starting a program called SCALP. And so Shinnecock Kelp farmers became aware of this and were really horrified at the name SCALP, because as part of colonization, the colonists would issue bounties on the scalps of indigenous women and children in order to increase their genocide and their land theft. They needed the land to for their livestock that were ever increasing. They needed the seaweed for their livestock. They needed all of our resources, and so they would murder our women and children and then take our land. And so it was really offensive to us when we heard about this program, which, you know, it's something that is very dear to us, co-culturing oyster, growing seaweed, something that we very much support, and yet they were calling the program SCALP, and it points to the lack of inclusiveness of indigenous people in the conversation at all. And we reached out to the county, and we're still awaiting a meeting to even be part of the discussion. I go to a lot of seaweed symposiums all across the nation, and you see so much in other parts of the country, specifically the West Coast. There are more efforts for co-stewardship and co-management of natural resources together with indigenous people, because it is so important that we recognize the practices that were before colonization and were before climate change, so that we can really regenerate and restore and go back to a sustainable way of providing food. That's what this is all about, providing food so that we can ensure our survival here. And, you know, also the beauty, the absolute gorgeousness of this place, protecting that for future generations. So when Sean said, "Are you at all interested in seaweed?" we said, yes, we are, definitely. And so we partnered with Green Wave to overcome one of the biggest challenges in this area, which is the rapid warming of the ocean and the water, the bay temperatures, which has made seaweed cultivation very difficult. We do work together very closely with the School of Atmospheric Science and Dr. Gobler and the Nature Conservancy. We do work with Suffolk County too, with their water quality restoration program, to run kind of the next generation of hatchery for sugar kelp. We are looking to expand. I don't want to get into monoculturing, which is something that we see so often. I really think that there's a lot of type of other seaweeds that we should be looking at, specifically in this region, sea lettuce, also red seaweeds in the warmer temperatures are things that we can be cultivating in our hatcheries. But really that those who are engaged in aquaculture as it pertains to seaweed be able to support those aquaculture specialists in oysters and scallops and clams and really foster together a relationship that can support co-culturing, because the oxygen exchange is so important and beneficial for the health of the bay and the ecosystem. So a lot of what Shinnecock Kelp farmers do is we're not so much looking at a cash crop, but a shift in the value system where we value clean water and we value sustainable regenerative aquaculture so that we can ensure that we can live here just as our ancestors have for another 7 generations. And the way that we're able to plan for the future 7 generations is by utilizing the knowledge the last 7 generations have left for us. And so whether that be through the treaties, the deeds, or just the knowledge of why this is important, it's the focus and heart of what we do. And it's why it's so important for us to work intergenerationally. For the Shinnecock Kelp farmers, the elders in our group, have direct memories of those who lived in the 1800s when we first were removed from this area and removed from being able to manage the bays. And so I just, again, really want to emphasize when we talk about partnerships, it has to be inclusive of Indigenous people. And if there's not already a place at the table, then, it really, there needs to be efforts made to make one in order for this to be a successful industry, because there is so much knowledge that we can weave together for the innovation that needs to happen to make this a viable effort for all of us to engage in. So thank you very much.
Any questions?
Questions?
Thank you so much for the history of that.
Yes, you're welcome.
So I was curious is there anywhere online where you have some of these, events in history that you're talking about that people can become more educated, like those cases, the name of the program is really kind of shocking, and the fact that you're not getting a meeting, but just something that's got a lot of this information in one place.
We do have a website, but we don't have that information on there. We do a lot of work with schools, universities. We also have curriculum for K to 12 where we talk about, photosynthesis and the importance of restoring oxygen and all of that stuff. But so far, it's just really been localized education. But that's a good suggestion to add it to our website, definitely. Yes.
I'm so curious, given all the, spaces that you're going to different symposiums across the country, can you share, there's an example that comes to mind where you feel like there's been successful co-stewardship or co-management like you're referring to, and what are some lessons that can be applied here potentially?
Yeah, recently Washington Sea Grant had a really fascinating seaweed symposium. In Washington State, they have something called the Bolt decision, which is really the model, I think, nationwide for what co-stewardship or co-management of coastal areas should look like. And it as part of a court settlement, the state basically splits 50-50 all of the bounty of the sea, whether it be seaweed or mussels, clams, oysters, with the local indigenous tribes. I think there's something like 13 in Washington. but it's really an equitable system where they work together to manage all of the fisheries, and it prevents like the overextension of the fisheries, and it helps because there's constant monitoring of both indigenous people and the local government, and then of course everyone who's out in the water every day as a bay person or what have you, to just make sure that everything is healthy, as healthy as can be. I know, like, especially in this region, there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between those who are out on the water every day and those who just don't have too much experience and really can't see the canary in the coal mine for what's happening in our local waterways with just kind of the complete lack of oxygen, which obviously all life needs oxygen in order to survive. Yes, I'll take it.
First of all, your presentation is one, such a great one. What do you do with the kelp that you harvest?
So we use turn it into a soil amendment. We work with nonprofits, garden ministries out on the East End. We work with groups that farm in order to produce food that goes to food pantries to feed people. We also started working with Huntington Reach, who's looking at using kelp as soil amendments for golf courses. We have a history with the Shinnecock Hills golf course being on one of our most sacred burial sites. And so from the start, we knew that we wanted to develop a liquefied form of kelp. We call it a kelp tea that could be used in place of kind of chemical fertilizers that just contribute to the nitrogen overload in the bays. But we focus primarily on, we don't sell any of our product. We barter it with these types of institutions in order to just try to reduce the amount of nitrogen that's going into the bay. And then, of course, we love seeing our traditional ways of agricultural used to produce food for those who don't have food. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Feel free to find me after.
So I just do want to give a shout out to Montauk Seaweed Company. So before you leave, make sure you pick up a bag of either the kelp meal or the kelp fertilizer. We've been using it out in our garden that you may have seen. We add it to our Vortex brewer, so we use it as a supplement, and we use a dosatron, so it gives a little bit of the kelp fertilizer to all of our plants outside and inside. So thank you very much. It was a great presentation. So now we're going to hear a little bit more about the science behind our kelp. So Katie Wooton is a senior research scientist at Stony Brook University, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Teal, and thank you, Kelly and Violet. I really appreciate those. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Katie Wooton. Troy Raspberry sends her apologies. She's actually right now in the middle of a preliminary defense committee, so someone is being antagonized right now and is very nervous, not just me. But yeah, so she sends her apologies, but I've done most of this research, so I think I can get through it a little bit. So I am a isotope geochemist and geochronologist. So my background is mostly more with rocks, but we do a lot with actually waters. We do stuff with teeth and bones. And then we have, over the last several years, been working a lot in plants. And so I want to talk a little bit about isotopes, specifically boron isotopes in plants, and the environment that our plants are growing in. Which one do I got it? Okay, there we go. So boron is an essential nutrient. We actually need it for our development, and plants need it. It's thought to be used in actually the cellular structure of plants growing, building their structure. But it's essential enough that actually vineyards will spray it onto their vines in order to get the vines to flower to have then grow grapes. Our vineyards up here on the North Fork do that. It also is essential enough that most of the farms across the United States spend millions of dollars to every year spray boron fertilizer specifically onto their fields, whether in pellet form or as a liquid. This is a field in Wisconsin, and I want to kind of talk about our research in kind of 3 steps. Two kind of initial, give you some background, small little case studies. The first one, working with the University of Wisconsin, looking at these fields. And then the last thing I want to talk about is actually some work that we did here outside with here in Southampton in the garden with Mike Dole. And so we have been lucky enough that we've been working for several years with a fellow in Wisconsin, and he connected us with the agricultural group up there at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And a couple years ago, they sent us some alfalfa to look at the boron isotopic composition in, as well as some of their fertilizers. And it was a very kind of surprising result. And so on this graph, if I point it here, how does it do it? Okay, let's point it on this one. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so on the y-axis here, we have our what's called the del 11B. This is just simply the mass ratio of the mass of boron 11 versus the mass of boron 10. So we have 2 different species of boron, one with a mass 10 and one with a mass 11. And so we're just looking at that ratio of how much boron 11 we have versus boron 10. And specifically, we are looking at it in relation to a standard that we define as 0, so that we're able to actually look at things and get an idea of how they relate to each other. And so I've got my 2 alfalfa plants here in green. And you'll notice that they are much higher than our actual pellet fertilizer and our liquid fertilizer, which are quite low in our del 11B, our ratio of 11 to 10. And in fact, if we look at the natural bedrock of these farms, which happens to be Silurian in age, the alfalfa boron signature actually much more closely represents the bedrock. So all of these farms are every year spending millions of dollars to put down fertilizer specifically for boron, and it doesn't appear that these plants are actually seeing that boron. We have thankfully a new master, or well, no, she's a new PhD student. She's finished her master's with us, continuing this work in Wisconsin, and so hopefully we'll have much more information on that in the next couple of years. Kind of the second part of the research, the background research I want to tell you about, is our work on seaweed. So seaweed is kind of considered one of our most primitive plants that we have. It's thought to maybe possibly be one of the very first plants that formed back 400 plus million years ago when plants were evolving. And so it can actually tell us a lot about plants and how they uptake nutrients into their bodies and what they are using. And seaweed is very interesting. So it's just sitting in seawater. And seawater actually has quite a bit of boron, about 4.5 parts per million ppm boron, which is a lot. Take my word for it. It's not as much as like sodium and stuff, but it's a lot. And the seaweed itself will intake and has about 30 parts per million ppm of boron, so much more than the seaweed around it. One of the interesting things we discovered, though, is that seaweed preferentially only takes up a very specific species of boron. It selectively intakes borate, which I'm going to talk about more in just a second. So, hang on. Let's take a step back. Let me tell you a little bit more about boron isotopes, not to totally bore you to death. But so boron, we have 2 different isotopes, 2 different masses of boron that we can have. We have boron 10 and 11, and we have 2 different species, molecules that boron tends to form. Specifically, boric acid, which wrong button. I apologize. Dang it. So this is a boric acid molecule, and borate are the two molecules that it'll form. In general, boron, the ratio of 11 to 10 boron is about 4. So there's 4 times more boron of mass 11 available than boron 10 in our environment. One of the neat things about boron is that these isotopes, boron 10 versus boron 11, actually will fractionate based on pH, and so we can tell a lot about an environment just looking at the boron isotopes. The other thing is that these two boron species, boric acid and borate, preferentially pick up either boron mass 10 or boron mass 11. Specifically, our borate prefers boron mass 10. And so when we look at seaweed, we see something very exciting and interesting. And so on this graph, on the y-axis, I have del 11b. So again, this is just our measure of boron 11, mass 11, over boron mass 10 versus a standard, which I have defined at 0. So we're all higher than the standard, versus pH on the bottom axis here. And as we go from a pH of 6, so acidic, up to a more basic, higher pH, a more basic solution, we change how boron is going to behave on whether or not we are going to form boric acid or whether we're going to form borate. And in seawater, we generally have a pH of about anywhere from like 7.8 to about 8.2-ish. And so that's what this gray bar shows, is kind of the pH of seawater. And this green dot here is our seaweed analyses. So boron actually has a del 11b of about 18, which is very shocking because seawater is very consistent across the globe and has a del 11b of about 39.6 per mil. So it is significantly different. The seaweed is significantly different from seawater. And looking at this diagram, you can take my word for it, what this actually means is that our seaweed is actually preferentially soaking up only borate from the seawater, so that more rare species in seawater, the 20% about, it's only in taking the 20% and leaving out 80% of the boron that it comes in contact with, which is quite surprising and not what researchers had originally thought. And so this is just kind of a quick diagram. So here we have, our two molecules of boron in seawater, and specifically kelp will intake just borate and form it into its different monesters and molecules for building. So just as a note, this is actually an Arabidopsis cell. This is not a seaweed cell, but I included it to kind of indicate. So what we think, since seaweed is just soaking up that 20% that's less available, but it's available in massive form in the ocean, is that actually plants, and very specifically seaweed, are actually regulating the intake of different molecules. In this case, borate is being regulated based on the pH of the cells that are bringing in boron. And we think that this is probably something that is occurring, and we know it occurs with other elements, but we're specifically looking at boron initially. And we are continuing this research, looking actually in genetics and the various markers for what these kind of on-off switches are that control the intake of boron into plants. But so those are the two sort of background things that I want you to know. And then I want to talk about what we've been doing for the last couple of years in collaboration with Mike Dole and the Southampton Marine Station. So Mike is out harvesting and putting out sugar kelp in various places on the Long Island Sound, Shinnecock Bay, Mauritius Bay. He's got some that are out in the East River near the New York campus of Stony Brook. And several years ago, about, I don't know if he was doing it before this, but about 2021, he began putting it in his garden beds. And I can't remember how we got in contact, but we actually got some kelp from him, and we started to do some experiments over the summer with some of our high school students, looking at boron, as seaweed as a fertilizer. And then in 2022, Mike and Craig Schoenen built a lovely garden bed out just near the greenhouse out of the way. You probably passed right by it, and planted various crops, carrots, spinach, and tomatoes, and then implemented a bunch of different fertilizers as well as controls, and specifically using seaweed as a fertilizer, and several of his seaweeds from different locations. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the results. There's a lot of data, but just a very small amount of the results that we have from that garden that are exciting. There's still more to be done, but what I have on here is I have 3 graphs. Again, I have my, on the y-axis, this del 11B, this measure of the amount of boron 11 over boron 10, with our standard being 0. And I have, the East River kelp, carrots specifically, we analyze the carrots. This is the Murchis Bay kelp carrots. And then he also had ulva, so this is a mix of, I believe, from Shinnecock Bay and Murchis Bay ulva that he put in as fertilizer. And so these are actually carrot leaves that I analyzed. And so each of these, oh, dang it, I screwed up, hang on. There we go. I didn't know about the little highlighting thing until today, so I'm still new at it. But so the squares here are analyses from 2 different weeks. I went out every other week and I collected leaves. Once we had fruit, we collected fruit. I collected soil samples, and then Mike provided me with the original kelp fertilizer, as well as I have some of the original soil. And so the leaves of the carrot plants are these 2 squares, or there's actually 4 squares, but these 2 separate weeks of squares. And then along the bottom here in the dotted line is the original soil. So this is the ratio of the original soil in kind of black, and then kind of shown in green for these. These are the range of the soils for this time period. Both of these samples are from late June into July. And then in green, the green line is actually the value of each of the various kelp fertilizers, or the ulva fertilizer in the last one. And kind of one sort of interesting thing that really struck us is that looking at the Murchis Bay kelp and the ulva mix. So first off, and I'll show you this in a second, the boron isotope ratios are actually elevated with respect to the control, as well as using just regular, I think it was Miracle-Gro, I'm not totally sure on which fertilizer, but just an average fertilizer that you can buy at the store, and more closely match what we would expect to be getting from the seaweed. But if you notice here, the East River kelp is actually much more elevated than either the Murchis Bay or the ulva fertilizers from our original kelp fertilizer. And I think that's very interesting. And that offset, may actually mean something. So East River is kind of considered more contaminated. There's a lot more stuff going into the river. There might be fertilizer running off, but among other things. And so that's one of the concerns with harvesting or planting kelp out in these areas is worrying about the conditions of the regions that it's being put into. So now on this diagram here, I have just the fertilizer. And so you'll notice it's a lower value. Our soil levels are still at about the same as where they were originally for our del 11B, for our mass 11 over 10. But the difference in how much boron there is versus the soil is more reminiscent of the fertilizer versus the East River. And we think that probably has to do with other components, other elements that are also in the East River kelp that maybe are not in the Murchis Bay and the ulva mixes, that are actually probably a good thing. Maybe there's more phosphorus that's being uptaken, more nitrogen. other elements that might be important. And so actually maybe planting kelp in sort of places that we think of as more contaminated might be better for kelp as a soil or as a soil additive. So there's still a lot more work to be done. One of the things, so just to kind of conclude, so it's, fertilizers do a pretty good job, but it does not appear that for boron specifically, that fertilizers are providing the boron that's being uptaken by plants. We're really excited about seaweed as a possible fertilizer, and are really excited to look into how the East River is different from the other kelp fertilizers that have been used. And finally, with our research in Wisconsin, and then all of the kelp farming that has been done out here at Southampton, our sort of ultimate secret goal is to one day hopefully be able to be providing Long Island kelp to our Wisconsin farmers that are farming alfalfa, and providing them with a better soil additive than what they're spending millions putting on the ground right now. And that's all. Do you guys have any questions? Thank you. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the process involved with actually measuring the boron. If this is something that could be like sort of a citizen science project. I know there's a lot of community oyster gardens that are popping up all over Long Island, and I know that there's interest in sort of community kelp gardens, and it would be interesting if there's a way as part of that volunteer opportunity for people to test the kelp and understand, the quality of it before being used as a soil mimic. Is that something that's accessible?
Yes and no. Isotope geochemistry is a little expensive depending on what you're doing. Measuring just the concentrations of boron is not nearly as expensive just because of the amount of work that has to go into it. However, Troy and I are both big advocates of having students in the lab. We work with high school students, we work with a ton of undergrads. We have several graduate students, and we are always extremely interested in having students come in the lab and work essentially, but doing research exactly like that. And so their analyses essentially I pay for with other work. And so we do have a lot of high school students and undergrads that we try and allow them to do research like that for free essentially. So yes, but just as a kind of just a general, we are always interested in projects. Like I said, we're really excited about working with Southampton and Chris Gobler's group and Mike Dole. And so, anything that we can do to help is always exciting. But it is like doing like a mass, like hundreds of samples is sort of more restrictive, but doing several samples is not a problem at all. So.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we have to pick up on some time here. So next we'll hear from Will Peckham of West Robbins Oyster Company. Sue Wicks couldn't make it today, and as I said, Will has very, very generously stepped in last minute. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. You may be able to tell I had a long and illustrious career in the Women's National Basketball Association. No, I'm just kidding. But really, with all due respect to Sue Wicks, who couldn't make it today, woman-owned business, commercial kelp farm in New York, second career as an oyster farmer, and sort of just a beacon of light and positivity within this industry. So if we could just get a round of applause for Sue, even in her absence. So I am a local oyster farmer. I have been farming oysters in Peconic Bay for around 9 years now. I got into this business because I was working elsewhere in New York City, and I went out to visit somebody on an oyster farm, and on the Fisher's Island oyster farm. And I realized right away that they were making a modest living while also using their business to improve the environment and improve the water quality generate all of these positive ecosystem services. And I knew right away that's what I wanted to do. And so when we think about shellfish and seaweed farming, there's this concept of these positive externalities where, I think one of the keys to having successful not only ecosystems, but also community networks to this spirit that sort of Tela is speaking to. Or like a lot of the monetary value when we think about this kind of regenerative work is not captured within the framework of what we think of as capitalism, right? A lot of it doesn't show up on the balance sheet, doesn't show up on the profit and loss statement, but your shellfish and your seaweed is actually removing excess nitrogen from the bays, which can then be cycled in these local economies. And so all around, it's generally a win-win. Maybe not so much right now for the practitioners, but definitely from the community and from the ecosystem perspective, it is. And I think a lot of us who are shellfish and seaweed growers take a lot of pride in that. So I'll just speak a little bit to why seaweed cultivation makes sense in the framework of shellfish aquaculture. One reason is that much of the cultivation infrastructure can be repurposed for seaweed, and it already exists for shellfish. So the specific infrastructure I'm speaking of is anchoring systems that go down into the seabed. They hold long lines and rope arrays, which can be used as, in broad strokes, sort of the framework that the seaweed or the macroalgae are grown on. So that decreases some of the financial barriers to entry. As others have mentioned, it's also highly complementary from a seasonal perspective. So shellfish, especially oysters, tend to moderate their metabolism based on the water temperature. So when the water temperature drops below, call it 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the metabolic rate for the oysters is vastly reduced. And along with that is our workload as shellfish farmers. So in the winter, we tend to have a fair amount of free time compared to the busy summer season. And that time could then be allocated to growing the seaweed crops. And I think it's pretty compelling to us as farmers. An interesting point on that is also that some of the research coming out now shows that summer seaweeds, Gracilaria, Ulva, and others are perhaps even more potent as fertilizers. And so I think it's important to think from our Long Island perspective, we're sort of, especially with climate change, we're sort of at a point where sugar kelp is perhaps not the best crop to be looking to for local production. I mean, certainly areas of Long Island Sound around Montauk Point, you get the water temperatures you need to grow kelp, but I think it's absolutely vital that the research into the more transient summer seaweeds continues. I'll just speak to a couple examples really quickly of farmers who I know personally. I'm sure I'm leaving out a great many, but these are existing integrations between shellfish and seaweed farmers and land farmers. So I know there's one grower in the Great South Bay, Matt Welling, who has taken to feeding his sugar kelp to cows and also as fertilizer over on McCary on the North Fork in the vineyard. And Sue Wicks, mentioned before, sells her kelp to Patty Gentry at Early Girl Farm. So that's another really cool example right over in Brookhaven of sort of, making these nutrient cycling loops far more local. It's just going up the road, and it doesn't have any of sort of the negative implications of carbon-based fertilizers. And one more. I was recently over at Island Time on Shelter Island, and they had used some wild harvested eelgrass that had washed up on shore to mulch their garlic beds. And when they broad fork these permanent beds, the eelgrass remnants are actually being cycled into the top 16 inches of the soil. And not to mention, it makes a really effective mulch and a beautiful row cover. So that's interesting, although the last thing we need is for people to go out and start digging up eelgrass. So maybe you didn't hear that here, and it's all washed up. Let me reiterate, it all washed up. So I think generally, broad strokes, what we're speaking about is kind of centering around these topics of, the co-cultivation of shellfish and seaweed being good business from the economics perspective, good stewardship, and perhaps most importantly, good community building. So I think that's one thing that we can all work on a lot here in Long Island, right, to the many points that Tela referenced. I tend to think of myself, I know other shellfish farmers do, we like to think of ourselves as stewards, and so anything that we can do to help and to help, this movement along, I think we're all very open-minded and happy to compromise, and of course, come up with institutions that reflect our diversity. And I have to also give a shameless plug for my own business. So West Robbins Oyster Company, we've been growing oysters in Peconic Bay for 8 or 9 years, and last year we were very lucky to be chosen as the steward of a property that we were able to purchase over in Mattituck, New York, so right just over on the North Fork. It's a 15-acre parcel that was formerly a potato field, and prior to that, I think going back millennia, I had read references that it was an indigenous sweat lodge or a ceremonial place. So just at the absolute beginning steps of digging into the history of this property. But our goal is to hopefully put into practice a lot of the topics that we've been talking about today, seeing if we can nutrient cycle, very local, so we would have the opportunity to actually grow shellfish in an upweller system on the creek, which does a really good job of incorporating nitrogen and phosphorus into the shellfish. So when those shellfish are physically removed, so right, like in contrast to an oyster restoration reef, which provides a number of benefits, but a lot of those oysters, those nutrients will never actually be removed or sequestered from the ecosystem. They just go into a different long cycle. We'd actually be physically removing those shellfish seed to go and then plant them at our farm in Peconic Bay. So you get this kind of hyper-local sequestration of the phosphorus and nitrogen, which are very elevated in this specific creek because of a ton of defunct wastewater systems from the sort of just, rampant suburban development, pretty dense, with septic systems that are halfway in the water table, which is not best practice. So there are 400,000 of those systems on Long Island that we need to replace. Anyway, that's beside the point. But what we hope to do is be, number one, good stewards of the land. We're seeking to start a small kind of 2-acre no-till flower and vegetable farm, and we really want to just highlight the intersections between the land and sea cultivation. And yeah, we're looking for partners. We'd like to work with many of you in this room, and hopefully we can think of this as a bit of a pilot project. That's what I have to share. Thank you. Any questions?
So where are you, was this part of the Conic Land Trust? Did they help you get that farm?
Yes.
I thought I read that.
Mm-hmm.
And where is it, Mattituck?
Mm-hmm. It's in Mattituck on New Suffolk Avenue. So they were, I believe the original seller had set it up to be subdivided into 8 homes. And so some community members got together, they raised a small amount of money to purchase it, and then subsequently sold 2 conservation easements on it. Most of the property is conserved in perpetuity.
Can people visit?
Yes, they can.
Yes?
Up to 25 per day. And so, yeah, actually one thing that jogged my memory, but speaking earlier about the barriers to this kind of work, right, and, the NIMBYism, I've already seen it. We've only owned this property less than a year, right, so we had a neighbor try to prevent us from purchasing it at the last step, sort of trying to intervene with the seller when they heard that there was a shellfish farm coming to town. And then we had, a subsequent flood of people who said, we don't want to see this. Our creek is residential. And, it takes a lot of restraint, it takes a lot of dialogue, but most importantly, I think it takes the time to explain, understand where people's viewpoints are coming from, and educate with facts. And I think that's just key to overcoming NIMBYism, because it's just a challenge on all avenues for us. So on the land side, another in the water in Great Peconic Bay. So it's just one of those things that's sort of table stakes for working in this business.
Thank you so much.
And again, we'll have more time to discuss in questions, but I want to move it along because we still have a couple more people to speak. And now we have our own esteemed Professor Chris Gobler from Stony Brook. So thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there on a Friday afternoon. And I acknowledge my partner in crime here, Michael Dole, who's been working with me since 2017, and 10 years as an oyster farmer before that, so he brought a lot of knowledge of aquaculture to the lab, and that's really transformed what we've been doing. And so today I'm going to talk about, and he actually, I should credit, if it weren't for Mike, I probably wouldn't be here. Because it's to talk about seaweed, because he introduced he came when he joined the lab. He came to me and he said, "There's these guys, Green Wave, and they're doing stuff with kelp. I think there's a lot of potential for it." I said, "Okay." We had been doing some things on other types of seaweeds, but maybe I would say I'd have nothing to say about kelp if it weren't for Mike. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about. Maybe I should just go back to the title there. Nitrogen removal by shellfish and seaweeds, and then just a little bit about soil amendments appropriate for the conference. So, but as we think about nitrogen removal, I almost always start with this slide and the idea of the connectedness between the land and the sea. And, it's just the foundation of living here on Long Island. The entire island's a watershed. And it's not just the sea, but it's also our drinking water, right? Everything that happens on land gets into what we're drinking. Unless you live in Brooklyn or Queens, if you're on Long Island, you're getting what you turn on the tap today, whatever you drank, it came from under your feet. And so you reap what you sow, and we need to be cognizant of land use practices because it can really alter the quality of our groundwater, which is our drinking water, and then certainly our surface waters. And I almost always show this plot, which essentially shows the historical picture of Suffolk County as it went from a rural county in the turn of the last century to now a suburbanized county with 1.5 million people presently, which is as much, more than Nassau County and as much as every other county, more than any other county in New York State except for Brooklyn and Queens. And as I just referenced, increasing population changes the character of our groundwater. And you can see that in the plot there on the right. And with rising levels, and that's specifically rising levels of nitrogen, and with rising levels of nitrogen, we have the process of eutrophication, which you've heard me talk about many times, I'm sure, if you've heard me talk before. Higher levels of nitrogen can stimulate the growth of primary producers. It can be phytoplankton, algae, even seaweeds. But we certainly have a eutrophication problem here across Long Island. This map is representative of sampling that my lab did last year, so just between April and September. And so during those months, you can see the widespread occurrence of things like harmful algal blooms, which are stimulated by nitrogen. And then the dark blue areas, those are hypoxic zones, also known as dead zones, areas of low oxygen. And of course, all life in our waters need oxygen to live, save for some bacteria. And so this is obviously, these are called impairments because this is affecting habitats, fisheries, and just way of life in general. And just a couple of examples here, as you can see, this is most common in areas that are shallow because therefore the amount of nitrogen coming in is large relative to the volume of water. And, the studies are in. There have been probably close to a dozen studies done looking at answering the question, where does the nitrogen come from? A decade ago, that question, people would have answers. If I asked everybody in the room, they'd raise their hands, and some people would say, oh, it's the runoff. Oh, it's, it's the fertilizer. And no, actually, it's the wastewater, which shouldn't be a surprise, right? We're not, despite the fact Suffolk County is an agricultural county, and is actually, I think, the top agricultural producer in New York State. Like I said, we're also the third most populous county in New York, which is includes the most populous city in the nation. So So it is the wastewater. Fertilizer is very important also, though. And I will also say that, when Suffolk County did their sub-watershed study, they divided up Suffolk County into more than 200 sub-watersheds. I could take you to, or we could go visit together, the sub-watersheds where fertilizer is the biggest source. So this is like on average. So it really depends where you go. So, and in any of those 200 sub-watersheds where wastewater is the number one source, the second one is fertilizer. So fertilizer is certainly very important. In recognition of this issue, I guess in 2014, this program began, but the Reclaim Our Waters program began to address this. It's evolved a lot. Their sub-watersheds plan is to transition hundreds of thousands of on-site septic systems to advanced systems that remove more nitrogen. And they're prioritizing 200,000 that are in the hot pink region there. And if you look at that, you can see that it's not a linear area at all. And so there's a lot of science that went into this, specifically choosing the areas that are most vulnerable with regards to our drinking water source, and also most vulnerable with regards to our surface waters. And you can see a lot of that hot pink is on the South Shore, because those South Shore bays are so shallow and therefore so vulnerable. But the fact of the matter is, to address this issue, that those first 200 systems out of the gate, that's by the year 2050. And furthermore, even once you do that, groundwater travel times are long. And so, in some cases, if you're right by the water, it's maybe 10 years. But there are places in Suffolk County where the travel times are 100 years. So it's going to take time. It's not going to take that long because the areas they're targeting are the nearshore areas. But bottom line is, this is a decadal project. This is the right way to go. This is how we're going to solve the problem. This is how we're going to solve the problem for future generations. But in the meanwhile, we do need some in-the-water solutions. And so that brings us to our subject here, thinking about shellfish and seaweeds and their ability to do all this. And so specifically, we know what shellfish and seaweeds do. They're good at removing nitrogen, good at removing carbon even. I gave a talk at a national meeting just last month, I guess that was 2 months ago, specifically on the carbon aspect, and that's super interesting also. And the fact that, just as an aside, I feel like I wanted to share the information there, that actually shellfish are a net source of carbon to the atmosphere. So some people say, oh, shellfish, they're a good carbon sink. Actually, they're not, but seaweeds are. And so you can actually make shellfish farm carbon neutral or negative by adding in seaweeds. That's a little aside. And we're working on something, making biochar out of seaweeds via a process called pyrolysis, and that makes the carbon actually sequestered forever. Could talk more about that later. But I just did want to get those things out there on the carbon front. But on the nitrogen front, of course, the shellfish and seaweeds are getting their nitrogen from the environment, and so therefore they're extracting them. And just as a quick aside, I'm going to show a lot of data on kelp, but we have been doing a lot of work on other seaweeds recently. I heard someone mention gracilaria before. We've actually discovered, we think, that this one here, first thing this, Agardiella, we think is a really good candidate for red seaweeds. We just started using this in the last couple of years. It grows really, really well. It seems more temperature tolerant. It seems more ubiquitous. And actually, as it turns out, a lot of what we thought was gracilaria out there is not actually gracilaria. And then we're also doing work on ulva. And in fact, we just started our first hatchery spawning of ulva onto long lines as we do with kelp. But I'm going to focus on kelp. I won't say a lot about it because there's already been a lot said about it, but it's an expanding market here in the Northeast. And so the project goal here was to try to understand how much nitrogen can we remove from shellfish farming and from kelp farming from different locations, and comparing those two to each other. So we've grown kelp on more than 15 locations across Long Island, but for this study, we're going to focus on the sites here, so Peconic Estuary in the furthest east, Moriches Bay, 2 sites in the North Shore, Mount Sinai Harbor and Northport Harbor, and then in the East River, all kelp sites. And you can see the different colors here. We use long lines for the deep water areas, and also the details of this momentarily. And then Mike's developed this shallow water system for farming kelp in shallow regions. You can see these sites are all 3 feet or less. And so the long lines are pretty standard. They're the same thing that are used for oyster farms and oyster aquaculture in deep waters. And the sites we worked in were 20 feet or so, but again, you can go even deeper than that. And incidentally, when we began our work, we were told, we said we're going to try to grow kelp in shallow waters, and we were told that's a stupid idea. That'll never work. Literally, we were told that. But Mike had ideas of trying something else. Specifically, he calls his staked line method. So putting out, and you can see how shallow the water is here, putting out staked lines within just a foot of water, and you can see on that PVC piece of PVC that's on the rope is a spool of kelp. And so, just as quick background, we spawn the kelp in the fall on those strings that are wrapped around that piece of PVC, and there you can see that string going out on the line. Typically goes out in December. We try to get it out as early as possible because we now know earlier the better, and the later the worst. So getting on to some of our results for these different locations, here's some growth results, and this is showing our data from 2022 and 2023. And so overall, you can see, firstly, the graphs start in December. That's when we get our first monitoring time point. And this is specifically the weight of the kelp that we're pulling out per meter of line. And this is a lot of work. I can just throw these graphs up here, but I should really acknowledge Mike and the whole team in the lab, because it's a big team, going all across these sites, sometimes twice a month, and in not great conditions. But overall, you can see what the pattern is. Not a lot of growth in those cold temperatures, right? And that's why getting out early is important, because you actually can get some good growth if you can get it out in November. We're learning that from this year. And then things start taking off as the water's warm. And the patterns here, very, very reproducible across the 2 different years. And I think what I just want to get to is you can see the general patterns here. But here's the net yield at the end, with statistics, for those of you who like multiple comparisons tests following a one-way ANOVA. And so the different letters tell you if they're different or not, the amount of yields per line. And so what you can see is our top 2 performers were in the East River. This was kind of expected. I've done work at the East River since I was a grad student. And that's one ecosystem along with Jamaica Bay where the nutrient levels are always high all year round. Normally there's actually a seasonal cycle to nutrients, high in the winter, almost non-existent, and very hard to measure in the summer. But high year-round in the East River. And that was our best yield. But Moriches Bay, in that 1 foot of water, our second highest yield. That was surprising. And then otherwise, outside of Moriches Bay, kind of an east-west gradient. And the Peconic Estuary, as you can see, not great yields for that system. And again, this is just showing the sites for those 2 locations. Mike and the team loves taking pictures of our East River site, because you've got the Throgneck Bridge always in the background there. So an interesting point about the nitrogen in that kelp, and this is that data, and this is reproducible, and we see it every single year. The nitrogen content per percent or per gram dry weight of the kelp decreases through the season. And so it's actually maximal when you're first starting measuring it. And you can see really, really high, like 5%. That is super, super high. And see how much it changes. In the end, when we pull it out, it's almost all less than 2%, right? So that's sort of an interesting back and forth. And I've talked about this with Mike, where we're eager to sort of get the last juice out of the kelp seeds and let it grow as long as it can. But as it turns out, when you do that, the longer you wait, the more nitrogen that you're losing. And that's probably a dual pattern of, one, the nitrogen levels in the water are decreasing, but also that the kelp are getting less healthy as temperature levels rise. But overall, if we look at the final harvest and we compare nitrogen content, you can see that this pattern's a little bit different. So but it perfectly matches actually the nitrogen in the water. And that you get the east-west gradient, highest in the East River, and then Moriches Bay being so shallow, we think there's a lot of groundwater seeps of nitrogen coming in there. But again, and Northport is right near, it has very high levels of nitrate in the groundwater there as well, and therefore also quite high. And you can see the overall patterns. And so now we can think about this idea of bioextraction. So we know our yields, we know the amount of nitrogen. Now we can come up with the amount of nitrogen yield removed per foot of line or per meter of line. So that's the data that you see here. And then from there, we wanted to scale up and understand how much can we remove on a kelp farm. And we considered both the long line scenario and then the shallow stake line scenario. And we've heard a lot about Sue Wicks. There's her oyster farm right now, but actually her oyster and kelp farm. She has the first commercial kelp farm on Long Island. And it happens to be about an acre in size, which is what we scaled up to. And it happens to be spaced about 1.5 feet apart. So that's really what we're looking at when we did this modeling. Although we did it in both ways. And just considered how many lines you can put in and what the yield would be based on what we've already found. So here we're looking at the different spacing, and this is the amount of nitrogen now you'd remove per hectare of kelp farm in each of these different locations. And you can see, again, the yields are really following the amount of growth, but then also to some extent the amount of nitrogen as well. And obviously the yield's much higher if you're spacing those a lot closer to each other. And yeah, big impact obviously in that urban setting, but also in the shallow lagoon. And I just mentioned, as I say shallow lagoon, I should also say, remember, those are the areas where we need to get a lot of the nitrogen out. That's where we're targeting, for example, septic system upgrades. Okay, so again, Mike has a lot of experience also in oysters. So we wanted to compare now the kelp to the oysters. And, this whole meeting, we talked about this co-culture. And I don't have, I think last year I might have presented on it, but another thing that we've done that's been very fun is looking at actually not just what you move out of the water, but the co-benefits between these two organisms. And so we consistently are able to show more rapid growth of shellfish when they're co-cultured with seaweeds. And what we just discovered that's very exciting is that, one, we know that's due to combating ocean acidification. And we published a paper on that in 2022, in that kelp raises the pH of the seawater, and we know that ocean acidic, and we had an example on a farm with low pH, where when you grew the shellfish in higher pH with the kelp, they grew significantly faster. We also know actually that kelp can get rid of harmful algal blooms, at least on a very small and localized scale, and that's why I use the term here, halo effect. But what we just discovered, and I don't have time to show it, so you're going to have to take my word for it, is that actually the shellfish, it seems, are actually, believe it or not, eating the seaweeds. So that is, the seaweeds are sloughing off some of their tissue. And of course, these big, just like we're made up of little cells, seaweeds are made up of little cells, and they're known to let off something known as seaweed detritus. And so it looks like the shellfish are actually getting a dietary supplement from the seaweeds. And it's not just the total amount of food either. There are specific omega fatty acids found in seaweeds that aren't found in the pelagic phytoplankton, specifically arachidonic acid, which is omega-6. Anyway, a little aside there. You can tell I'm excited about that. Yeah. And then, so to compare to oyster bioextraction, Mike had published this paper with Jeff Levington when he was at the Ecology and Evolution Department on main campus, specifically looking at this. How much nitrogen do oysters remove? And he just happened to do that study in two locations, in Jamaica Bay and Great South Bay, which are really close to Moriches Bay and the East River. So we kind of put these together to represent an urban setting and one of these South Shore lagoons. And so specifically looking at the growing season, the oysters were considered their growth season being June through October, and I've already showed you when the kelp grow, which is mainly through the spring or winter in the spring. And all the details, the number of harvest hectare, the oysters harvested per hectare, and the amount of nitrogen that came along with that. But now here is comparing the kelp to the oysters. And so they're of a similar magnitude, the amount you can remove, but actually you're getting more out of the kelp than out of the oysters, which is interesting. But obviously what's really important is you want to put those two together. And so now here are the yields you're getting. So hundreds of kilograms of nitrogen being removed per hectare in these different locations. And so let's put that into perspective. You know, if you compare that to septic tanks and septic systems and what one individual upgraded septic system can do, you're representing here, you know, dozens and dozens of these septic systems potentially. And, you know, that costs a lot of money. And again, I'm not saying this is instead of that. I'm just putting that to be relative. And remember, we were only looking at kelp. But what we're really doing now, in fact, we're getting our kelp out so we can get in our different types of red seaweeds and green seaweeds. And so, you know, that number back here and that comparison, you know, that if you, instead of kelp, if we made that seaweeds, that bar could maybe even double in size, and we could further expand that. And again, not just in the interest of further removing nitrogen. And very last thing, I'm going to present just some data that we have using seaweeds as fertilizer, and that's kind of where we are here, right? Let's not import that fertilizer. What an amazing thing if we could, instead of having, and again, the vision that I've shared with people, other people seems to resonate with, is imagine all those 18-wheeler trucks coming over the bridges onto Long Island filled with, you know, tons of fertilizer. It happens every year, and you know, you can go to the hardware stores and see them all. Imagine if we could shut off that and instead turn it into a circular loop with the seaweeds. And so here's some data on nitrogen and phosphorus content of different fertilizers. And if you've seen this slide before, you know there's sort of a trick, but I've hid the x-axis, so now you'll have to guess. I'll give you a hint. One of these is a commercial fertilizer, and the two other are not. So you can look at the bars as the amount of nitrogen and amount of phosphorus per liter. And so now I'll do the big reveal. And so bottom line is that, you know, we're getting really high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus if we're from some of these fertilizer products that we've just played around with, really, taking the seaweeds and putting them into a liquefied form. We've also done soil amendments as well, and just showing some, you know, again, some quantitative data. Here's growing some eggplants. That's actually my son holding up the treatment and the control, several years ago now. But significantly better yields with weight with regards to eggplants, also with regards to bell peppers. Here with using flowers, specifically marigolds. And in this case, it's more played out because we've got our negative control, nothing added. Positive control is Miracle Grow, using kelp, using summer seaweeds, and actually using a combination of those two. And you can see they actually seem to be complementary, and that you get a better yield when you mix the two together. So in interest of time, I won't go over everything else, but actually Katie did a nice job at least showing some of our carrot experiments. So we've gotten better yields and similar yields to commercial fertilizers with carrots, but also tomatoes, spinach, turf grass. So there's potential there, and I guess there's a whole company that will tell you that is the case, so I don't need to be selling you on that. So I'll just wrap up. I showed you where nitrogen bioextraction was the highest, expected in the urban waters, but not expected, you know, second highest was right there in Moriches Bay. The lowest was in the Peconic Estuary where the nitrogen levels are lower, so that made sense to us. You know, you actually get more nitrogen taken out via the kelp than the oysters, but obviously we're talking about doing this together, and there's lots of co-benefits of that. And you're removing per hectare hundreds of kilograms of nitrogen during this process, and that's equivalent to upgrading many, many septic systems. And again, we need to do both, but while we're waiting for the other ones to have their effect, this is something that can be done in parallel. And then, you know, I showed you that these seaweeds can be an effective fertilizer also. So with that, we'll thank all the kelp heads in the Gobler lab and funding sources, and I thank you for your attendance and your attention. Thank you. Chris. The most similar that I can give there is the stuff that we've done in Georgia Pond. where we've put out, that was a system that experienced toxic cyanobacterial blooms, literally anoxic water, so like no oxygen, and was just choked entirely every summer with seaweeds, but also macrophytes. And so with that observation, we brought in a vessel that could actually go in and sort of literally harvest, so with a cutter, cut those out, and so through the process it removed, in a summer, 100,000 pounds of that material could be removed, and that ended up being 10 to 30% of the nitrogen and phosphorus. But it also, once that started, those events stopped. So anyway, that's the freshwater equivalent. So yeah.
But nothing like intentionally harvested.
I'd have to look into it. Not that I'm aware of, but I'm sure. Well, actually, I take that back. Now, there are things you could do as like a floating islands. Although I'm always, I think those yields are always going to be small, but that would be an option there. Yes, Hope.
As I mentioned, I've seen photographs of seaweed being farmed in Shinnecock Bay. My simple question is there a reason you didn't include that in your test sites?
For Shinnecock Bay, we have grown seaweeds in Shinnecock Bay, and I think we had a whole presentation of how successful that can be. So we have done it. It wasn't part of that particular study, but we've grown seaweeds all over Shinnecock Bay and had success with it. It just wasn't part of the study.
Oh, that's good news.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your work always.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Let's set this question up, but can you speak to us more about the carbon removal potential of kelps and what you found?
Yeah, basically and it was kind of similar to this, but it was the carbon side. And again, what it was is that the bottom, contrary to some opinions, and actually even in the peer-reviewed literature, shellfish are a net source of CO2 to the atmosphere. They respire like you and I do, so even though they do pull some carbon into their tissue, into their shell, they're letting off more CO2 than they're pulling in. But if by growing the seaweeds, you're then offsetting that carbon. Now, if you want to be really hardcore about it, or actually not hardcore, to be realistic, if we're thinking about carbon sequestration, right, just throwing that kelp then into a pile, well, then that's going to turn back to CO2 as well, right? So people are thinking about now, well, what do you do with that? Now, some people, there are literally companies started now to bale up seaweeds and dump it into the deep ocean. And if you do that, you actually do remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. We can debate if that's the right way to go. But like I said, I've been looking into, actually I'm working with some people at an agricultural research facility, actually in Connecticut, to actually do this pyrolysis, pyrolysis, turning biomass into biochar. And in that case, because it gets combusted at an ultra-high temperature in the absence of oxygen, you don't form CO2, so it makes like a charcoal almost. And that can be a soil amendment, but it also prevents the loss of CO2. So I don't know if that answered your question, but okay. Yeah, Tela.
Question about updated feasibility studies for the Vaconic estuary using hermetophytes that are getting out earlier in like October compared to December.
Yeah.
I know we've seen like massively increased biomass.
Yeah. So I think we're going to have some data on that from this year, and I think it's going to be better because definitely so the gametophyte lines that go out earlier. Yeah, that it seems like that fall growth is really important for sort of really getting the kelp into a good physiological state for the winter, and then to like pick it up again and grow fast in the spring.
One more question about
Yeah.
reversing the impacts of ocean acidification on shellfish. How many cycles or seasons does it take to really kind of see an improvement in the brittleness of the shellfish that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I think it can be addressed right away. The one important thing, of course, is it's a very localized effect, right? So, when we had our control were oysters that were just like 100 feet away. So So I think it can, like, right away have an effect, but again, it's important to be realistic with it. So, like, again, we're not fighting global climate change with this, we're not reversing ocean acidification, but we can do it on a localized scale. Yeah.
Regarding carbon sequestration using kelp, you mentioned, to be realistic, if we just take kelp out of the water and put it on land, it'll ultimately, that carbon will go back into the atmosphere. What if you were to make kelp meal out of it and put it into the sled?
Yeah, I think that also has some potential as well. Yeah, for sure. Yes, that's a good question, and I think, it's the percentage is less clear, but that's a very, very good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. I was remiss to not bring it up, and it's that's just like, health. Of course, I'm not an ag guy, so maybe I can be forgiven for that. But yeah, that was. I now remember the talk I gave, the 3 things, like sinking in the deep ocean, the biochar, but also as a dried soil amendment. Yeah, you can. Some of that will go back to CO2, but you definitely will sequester some of that into the soil. So good point. Yeah.
I found that point that you made very interesting about the shellfish actually eating the broken down seaweeds. And I'm not sure, I just wanted to ask if you're familiar with any of the literature about the detrital component of shellfish. There was some study up in the Wisconsin maybe 15 years ago, and one thing that they found was that early in the season, their predicted growth models for the shellfish, especially at depth, had a really poor fit, and they were trying to explain it, and they couldn't, but they're only using photosynthetic sensors, right? They're trying to see how much chlorophyll.
Yeah.
So their food model is not fitting very well. So they put a turbidity sensor in, and they figure out that especially on the shoulder seasons, when you don't have all this photosynthesis,
Yeah.
the shellfish are actually eating that detrital component.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating.
Yeah.
Because it just changes the way
It's
we think about shellfish feed. And
absolutely.
it makes me wonder if we can fatten them up, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, you really want to have your mind blown. I have colleagues at the University of Connecticut who do endoscopy on oysters. So they go into the oysters. And so, I mean, the really crazy thing is, so they're, when we think, probably, I mean, before I knew this is how I would think about it. Oh, it's like a straw. They just suck it all up and that's it. Actually, oysters are super sophisticated. They take it in and they actually have a service where they sort the particles. Now, I'm totally serious. And they based on the chemical characteristics of the particles, they'll say, yeah, I don't want that. And they actually reject it before they eat it. And then they take the other one and say, yeah, that's good food. And they'll take it in. So they're actually very, very smart. So they're doing that on purpose. Like, and that is, they're looking at the detritus and they're making a judgment call that, yeah, that's going to be some good food. Yeah.
And that's why they only pseudo-food, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the stuff they let out are the pseudofeces that they reject. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, you've been really great sports, because I know it's been really fascinating, but it is a long time. But we have one more speaker before our closing remarks, and that is Bonnie Brady. Where's Bonnie? Bonnie. Up here you are. Did you sort out your presentation?
I think so, or it might be a really short presentation.
Oh, no, it's great. Great to see you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, and can you, I just say, you want to say where you're from?
Sure. Oh, great, I can see this. This is like my 4th PowerPoint ever, so bear with me. I'm Bonnie Brady. I'm the Executive Director of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. And I'm here today to talk to you about why it's important to buy and eat local Long Island wild-caught seafood. Now, there's a button I'm supposed to use. Okay, this one, right, Frank? Okay, here we go. Wish me luck. On Long Island, where 99% of your seafood is landed, there are over 900 men and women who hold licenses to fish commercially. There are many different types of commercial fishing boats, most based on gear type and size will determine how many months of the year they can work. This is a trawler. They use a net and catch fish like scup, otherwise known as porgies, cod, and fluke. Long lines place a series of hooks in the water in which they catch species like tuna, swordfish, and tilefish. Gill netters use a net that uses weights to hang the net near to the ocean floor. Monkfish, skate, striped bass, and dogfish are often caught by Long Island gill netters. Plus, of course, we have lobster, trap, and pot fishermen who also catch conch, black sea bass, and tautog in their pots, clammers like the one in the picture off of Fire Island, and pound nets, which many of you have probably seen around the bays.
We also have Long Island quahog and scallop harvesters. Some scallopers use a dredge in specifically allowed areas. Others use a trawl, and quahog clams use a dredge and, like scallopers, can only fish in certain areas. Montauk is New York's largest commercial fishing port and the 48th largest commercial fishing port in the U.S. Woo-woo. Based on weight, and 52nd in the nation based on dollar value of those species. 9.4 million pounds of fish worth close to $20 million in 2022, the most recent year I could get numbers on, becomes a $90 million economic lift to the local year-round community with the fishing economic multiplier. Shinnecock is Long Island's second largest port with just shy of 3 million pounds of fish worth close to $5 million, which translates into $22 million into the community. I like this. This is pretty cool. New York State's catch in 2022, 19.21 million pounds of fish and shellfish. It's worth $38.8 million to Long Island's fleet at the dock and $174.6 million to from boat to fisheries infrastructure businesses. That's the fuel, the ice, the cartons, transportation, shipyard for repairs, grocery stores, they buy grub, all of that gear. Overall, New York's commercial fishing industry from our boat to a restaurant plate is a $1 billion business per year. So here they are, the biggest catches in New York by pounds. That's 2022. So at the top of the list, we've got loligo squid, which you all know is calamari, scalp, which is porgies and delicious, fluke, quahogs, menhaden, which is bunker. It's used a lot for bait. Tilefish, black sea bass, whiting, monkfish, skates, bluefish, butterfish, and striped bass. Those are all by pounds, was 2022's big highlight fisheries. I'm not sure how many you guys have eaten. I think I've done everything except for the menhaden, and I wouldn't suggest eating the menhaden. It's too mushy. So, of course, no fishery in the U.S. takes place without regulations, and we, like farmers, have plenty of them. Here's the part where I feel like I'm on the Academy Awards, and I'm going to roll through the various things. It's going to be boring as hell, but just bear with me, just so you know it actually exists. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, the Fishery Conservation and Management Act of '76, is the regulatory Bible of commercial fisheries. It was passed into law in 1976, and it established the creation of 8 regional fishery management councils that advise National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, otherwise known as NOAA's, National Marine Fisheries Service, which is known as NMFS, which sits in the Department of Commerce. NMFS has regulatory power of fisheries in federal waters from 3 to 200 miles offshore, what we call the exclusive economic zone. Fisheries management, guided by Magnuson, works to prevent overfishing, rebuild overfished stocks, increase long-term economic and social benefits to the fisheries, and ensure a safe and sustainable seafood supply. National standards, there's 10 of them, have principles that promote fisheries, sustainable fisheries management, preventing overfishing while achieving optimum yield in fisheries, to reducing bycatch, and ensuring safety at sea. Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, oh look, I've got a pointer. There we are, and we're part of the Mid-Atlantic Council for specifically regulatory. National Marine Fisheries, they advise National Marine Fisheries on fisheries policy. National Marine Fisheries actually makes the regulations based on the advice of the councils. Usually it works that way. Council is made up of 21 voting and non-voting reps. That includes a federal rep, 7 member states from their fish and wildlife person in that state, and 13 private citizens that are chosen by the governor of each state. Everyone has their own state seat, and then there's a couple of at-large seats every year. The governor puts in submissions to NOAA, and we find out in a couple of months who's going to be on the council. The problem is, Long Island sits, I put a little star just for reference, at the corner of 2 councils. We've got the New England Fishery Management Council, which is from Maine to Connecticut, and then we have New York down to North Carolina, which I couldn't fit on the map. The issue is, of course, that we don't have a seat on the New England Council, and we have fisheries that they regulate. So, the whiting fishery, the monkfish fishery, and and cod, which is part of the groundfish complex, are all regulated by New England, and we have virtually no say, except for when I go up to the mic and go, "Excuse me." And unfortunately, they don't listen as often as one would wish. I've tried since Steve Israel was in Congress with Tim Bishop to do the New York Fair Fishing Act to get a seat for New York on the New England Council, and so far the northern states won't let us. For state waters, which are considered the shoreline from 0 at the shore to 3 miles outside, you have another regulatory body called the Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission. They have from from Maine all the way down to Florida, and they regulate 27 nearshore fish species. Each state has 3 commissioners. You've got the state fish and wildlife person, you've got a state legislator or proxy, and you have an individual appointed, again, by the governor of the state. In addition to the 3 management councils that are we also are regulated by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, NIMS directly, and the U.S. Coast Guard, which I forgot to put a slide in, sorry. Each fishery has a management plan, requirements based on one's gear type. Basically, you've got books about this big for each fishery, where they can fish, where they can't fish, closures, whether they're spawning closures, rolling stock closures, gear restricted areas, you name it, and it changes depending upon the season and often the amount of participants, at least at the state level, in each fishery. All species are regulated to prevent overfishing and overfish status, and if one becomes overfished, it is put on a rebuilding plan. Every commercial fisherman is required to measure each fish and guarantee sustainable size limits, which they have for everything, and no matter whether you only catch 100 pounds or 10,000 pounds, every single fish has to be measured before you put it in the fish hold. Fishermen fill out a vessel trip report with all species caught and submit it electronically now to National Marine Fisheries Service, unless you're a state boat, and then you have, I'm not sure if they're completely electronic yet, but they're trying. Otherwise, you've got a paper vessel trip report that you fill out. And you're subject to severe fines and jail time if found to be illegally harvesting fish. And they've put people in jail for that. So why is it important to buy and eat wild-caught local Long Island seafood? Because U.S. is the gold standard for sustainability when it comes to commercial fishing. Right now, this is 2022 status of the stocks, comes out about September of every year because they have to get all the information and then they put it into a new report. The simplest way to look at it is over there on the left. National Marine Fisheries Service, here, let me do it this way so I can point. National Marine Fisheries Service manages 492 stocks and stock complexes. For the overfishing status, they know for 355 stocks, 24 are subjected to overfishing, 331 are not. So that's the top fish up there, just a tip of the tail. Overfishing also does not necessarily mean that the fishermen are catching too much. The overfishing is the only definition. If it's depleted, it's still overfishing. Some cases it should be overeating, but it's not by another predatory species. It's not. It determines the spawning stock biomass. When the gurus at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center look at all the models that they have, they determine, based on the models that are also including fishery-dependent and fishery-independent surveys, the spawning stock biomass, which is the amount of the stock that is considered fertile that can reproduce itself to that level so that whatever amount you take out can be reproduced the following year. Kind of, sort of. And, well, that's about the best I could do for that. Back to the overfish status, they know for 249 stocks, 201 are not overfished and 48 are overfished, so 4 out of 5 are not overfished. And that changes depending on the year. Since I've been doing this since 2001, they've taken, I want to say, about 50 off of the list. Last year, the year before, 26 on the overfishing list, 24 this year, 51 last year that we had records for, the second to last year, 48 for 2022, 47 stocks on the rebuilt list, 49 stocks on the rebuilt list. And plus, fish eat each other. It's an eat or be eaten world. So there are stocks over time that sit there and have a huge abundance. Scup is one of them. They're at about 203% of their spawning stock biomass. Depending on who's the predator and who's the prey, some stocks wind up faring less well. Winter flounder, which used to be $1 million fishery to Long Island, apparently needs a cold water event, like a really cold winter, so that, because they spawn in the winter, they actually come from offshore and they go inshore off Long Island to spawn, and also by Nantucket Shoals. And if it stays cold, then their predators from the south, they need to be able to get big enough so that the predators in the spring don't come and eat them. And so that's what we haven't had recently. Let's see. Why should you buy US fish? No guarantees when you buy imported fish, none at all. They're not held to any sustainability level. We're held to this incredibly high standard to prevent overfishing and maintain sorry, that's hard to say a lot, sustainability of the stocks, and yet every import that comes flooding into this country has no limits on it whatsoever. You'll hear the number 90% or 92% of all the stocks of fish, the fish that come in are imported that Americans eat. It's not quite right. It's more like about 70%. The difference is, for some companies on both coasts, it's cheaper to take the fish that the fishermen catch, ship them overseas to clean them, and then send them back here because they can't get the permits to grow their businesses here in the US, or it's just cheaper. No requirement to hold, I said that before, yes, to the same sustainability standards. I'll just speak slower. And for extra points, the FDA only checks about 10% of the fish that come into the US as imports. So you're really spinning a wheel, and 9 out of 10 chances aren't probably very good. Also, farm fish, it's also not regulated as an import. I would suggest those of you that really are curious, look up Pangaseus in Vietnam, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon in a bush post in the middle of the jungle. They needed protein because there wasn't a lot. There was bushmeat, but, or a complex carbohydrate with beans, but there really wasn't a lot of protein. You had two kinds of marasma and kwashiorkor. For malnutrition, marasma was you just didn't have enough food. Kwashiorkor means you didn't have enough protein. Those are the kids with a huge belly. So that's why some of the fish people there were actually digging a ditch and growing tilapias, because a way to give them a protein source. We don't have that issue here. We've got hugely abundant stocks. And fast fact, in 1998, Sustainable Fisheries Act required every fish that was considered overfished to be held to a 10-year timeline to rebuild, whether the stock was involved with that or not. At the time, it was, I believe, tilapia was a $55 million industry here in the US. And fast forward 20 years later, when the amount of imports, I believe, were 52% to start out in 96, to where we are now, tilapia is now a $5 billion industry. What happened was fishermen here were getting cut on stocks, and as a result, people weren't stopping eating fish. They were just stopped eating ours. So buying local wild-caught fish is good for the fish, it's good for the fishermen, and it's good for the fishing communities. It's pretty simple. I took that when I was on my bike the other day. Anyway, thank you very much. Anyone has any questions? Oh, yes?
How much of our local catch is sent to a distributor like Hunts Point and then back? When we see local,
Right.
it's not really coming from the fishermen directly.
Well, it depends, honestly. Local, offshore doesn't close in the wintertime. So what I was talking about with boats, as far as in the size of the boat, determines whether you fish offshore or inshore. You don't want to go out in a 50-foot boat in the middle of January. So a lot of the fish in the summer can be sold by other dealers. You've got, I'm thinking locally, just from the East End, you've got Braun's. You actually have Julie Lofstead, who just bought some fish market in town. You've got Gosman's. In the wintertime, a lot of that fish, because some of the restaurants aren't open, they wind up getting put on a truck. Boat lands the fish, puts it onto pallets. Pallets go into the reefer truck. The reefer truck leaves about 10 o'clock at night, drives into Hunts Point, and then they're all sold at auction. Now, some of those fish, talk about carbon miles, some of those fish literally are sold, packed up, and sent right back out east. It depends. The other fish, as far as in distributed, a lot of the places that are processing, like Rhode Island or New Jersey, or New Bedford, they do a lot of export of fishing also. But there still are places that locally will buy fish. A lot of restaurants, it's not that hard to get a dealer's license. And paperwork is also another regulatory hurdle, but you can actually access local fish here pretty much year-round. The only thing I also know is that if commercial fishermen in New York State are allowed to sell fish right off their boat. They can't fillet it for you, but they can sell it right off their boat. So if you know somebody, hit them up. Anybody else? Yes.
What work do you do with organizations like the Natural Resources Defense Council? And then what are your thoughts about certifications like the National Stewardship Council?
Well, let's see. I'll go with NRDC first. NRDC has sued fishermen in the past. They've actually sued National Marine Fisheries Service over policy. I think they came up with a phrase about bizarro world during Amendment 12, I think, because whatever the regulation was, it had less than a 25% chance of rebuilding the stock, and so they threw it out. I actually know Brad Sewell, who I think, unless he's retired, is still at NRDC. He and I sit on the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning advisory panel, if he's still there. I haven't seen him actually in a while, so he may have retired. On certain issues, we actually, in the past, have been pretty much in alignment. I'm thinking back to when the Mid-Atlantic Council was discussing offshore wind and the idea for anything that would be industrializing the ocean to have it looked at the same as any other industrialization, and Brad was right there with me on that, so that was appreciated. MSC certification, wasn't that World Wildlife Fund, I thought, started that way back in the 2000s. They had a part in one of the European things. I think it's a good program. They spend a lot of money to get a fishery certified. Rhode Island and New Jersey, 2 processors, they just got porgies, scalp certified, so they're catching a lot of that, and it's going overseas. In the EU, many of those states require the MSC certification. I'm trying to think, there's been a couple of others over time that have been. It's really difficult to do unless you have a whole bunch of money, though. So like our association, you know, for all the, you know, we charge guys about $100 each, you know, so for all the karma points I'm doing this, I don't even get a paycheck. But the certification, I think, that takes place in the US would hold up to anyone. I mean, if you go through and you read one of these books and you see what is necessary and that the assessments that are done, the benchmark assessments, the updated assessments, the entire point of a council and a fishery management plan is to make sure that you don't overfish the stock. Commercial guys are held to a pound for pound limit. You go over by 10 pounds, they take 10 pounds off in next year. The issue, unfortunately, is the recreational fleet sometimes looks at limits as or going over, not on their own intention, but they do, and it's more of a suggestion than a specific. They've gone over on fluke sometimes 200, 300%, so much so that the spawning stock biomass was affected, giving us a cut, so then we got a cut even though we had no part in it. So that's a problem. Did I answer your question, sort of? What did you want to know about the MSC? I mean, there's all kinds of variations. Right. Well, I think the most important thing, in 2006, we got a $50,000 grant from Pride of New York Seafood Campaign. That was a segue of their Pride of New York fruit, or, you know, farmers food campaign. And we did a thing where we were doing a point of service. We created a 3-panel leaflet to be sold at seafood shops. I had ice picks made. This is when country of origin labeling was there, to be able to show this was local, decals on the doors at restaurants, table tents, explaining, ask your server what's local tonight. That was way before anybody was doing it. There were some parts that worked really well. I think the seafood shop component worked really well. What we found in the restaurants was that it was only as good as the manager training the staff to let them know, and actually making sure that the chef was actually purchasing that fish. You know, restaurants are all about price point, and back, 30, 40 years ago, they were doing monkfish for lobsters and skate wings for scallops. So it's really, that's the part. You need to go to somewhere that you trust.
That was great.
Yeah. Oh.
If anyone has more questions.
Yeah, you can find me afterwards because you guys are on a schedule. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry to cut that short, but I'm sure we all need to move along, and I'm going to pass it over to Suffolk County Legislator Ann Welker, who's a great environmentalist and taking over from Bridget Fleming. So there you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks to all of you for being here, but big thank you to Judy Ann and her team who've done an amazing job compiling an impressive group of speakers this afternoon. So thank you to that. Also, thank you to all of you for taking the time to be here too. Chris Gobler always says it's the I'm going to say the boots in the field and the fins in the water, that you guys all make such a huge difference with the work you're doing, so thank you for that. I just want to give a really quick legislative update, and I'm connecting it as best I can to seed to seed. And I want to just, it's such a good segue, Bonnie, coming from your talk. So there's a glimmer of awareness in the county that a seafood processing facility is needed. I know there's talk of one in Montauk, but there's also talk of one in the county. It would probably be in the middle of the county, so west of here, but it still would prevent the trucks from going from Montauk to New York and then back out here. So as far as I'm concerned, a glimmer in government is hope, and hope is a good thing. Government does move glacially, but there's real hope there. But what's happening right now in the legislature, in legislative activity, there are committees, which are sort of like work sessions for town board. So I'm part of the Environment and Parks and Agriculture Committee, and the other day, a resolution was brought forward by former State Assemblyman Steve Engelbright, who is now a Suffolk County legislature, and this resolution is similar to one that was passed in New York City recently. And it's in New York, it's called, it's Skip the Stuff, and it was just brought forward in East Hampton Village, and by the Surfrider, it was a movement by the Surfrider, the Eastern Long Island chapter of Surfrider. What it is, according to beach cleanup data, 67% of beach cleanup materials are food-related articles. So this is resolution to have takeaway items when you purchase something from a deli, instead of the plastic silverware and the condiments automatically being put into a bag for you to take with you. It's for you to request, you as the consumer, to request those articles, or that they be put over on the side where you can get them yourself. So that there's a little bit of process, but it was presented at committee. It now goes to a public hearing on Tuesday, and then it would be approved hopefully approved in our June meeting. But the fact that it's already been approved in East Hampton Village and in New York City, now we have to skip those two areas and get some more movement in the rest of the county. So that's my quick update. But thank you so much to all of you for being here today, for Judy Ann for leading the charge in this important conversation. And I do want to just give a quick shout out to the Food Lab. If you haven't been to tea on Tuesdays, it's wonderful. It's 3:30 in the afternoon till 5:30 once a month. There's one this coming Tuesday. It's just next door. It's a Food Lab initiative. It's lovely. So thank you to all of you for being here today.
Okay, so now, that was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for presenting. And now we could step outside if you want to continue the conversation. There's some food, some hors d'oeuvres, and some, I guess it's just like seltzer and water, but feel free to carry on the conversation. And also there is a plant sale going on in the greenhouse from 4 to 6. So if you want to pick up some vegetables or flowers or pollinator plants, you can do that there too. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you again, Frank, too. I guess we could just open that.